Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast. College football season inches closer by the day, and it's time that we got the gang back together to talk a little Power 4 conference football. I am your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined, as always, when it comes to major college football, by my esteemed colleagues and co-host, Brad Powers and Payne Insider. And gentlemen, I was going through my notes. I was looking at timestamps. The last time the three of us have officially powwowed in a major capacity on college football all the way back on January 5th. It's good to be back with you, fellas. It means the season is rapidly approaching.
Very good to be back. I've been back, though, the last 5 weeks for everyone listening. But I can tell you guys, I am legitimately excited to talk ball. Full disclosure, you could tell, because, I mean, before getting this podcast started, you and the three of us had a lengthy discussion. So very excited to talk ball anytime with you guys.
This is the time of year. This is where the big boys come out. I like this. ACC Preview. This is usually one of our most listened to preview podcasts, so I've been looking forward to it.
And Brad, you mentioned it. I mean, for those folks that are just tuning back in for college football, you have done an outstanding job keeping everything afloat with all of the smaller conferences. Can't thank you enough for doing that and taking on that large endeavor. For folks who haven't listened, Brad broke down Conference USA, the MAC, the AAC, the Sun Belt. Make sure you go back and listen to all of those shows. It'll get you prepped for all of the smaller schools going forward. So, Brad, thanks for holding down the fort. But, yep, gentlemen, it's all about the ACC. And while we won't cover every team in its entirety, to avoid the inevitable finger-pointing of us playing favorites, making it all pro-Florida State, anti-Miami, or however people want to try and spin this, we'll dive into some of the marquee programs in the league in alphabetical order. And for the first time in ACC history, we're starting out on the West Coast with one of the new entrants in the ACC, the California Golden Bears, who will make their inaugural push through the league. When we look at Cal, their win total for the first foray into ACC football sits at 6.5, heavily shaded to the under. They are, of course, major long shots to win the league, right around 100-1. And when you look at this Cal team, the final month of the season will give them a little bit of breathing room, but there is no doubt the Cals, the Stanfords, the SMU are going to find more rigorous travel than what they've grown accustomed to in the past. When we look at this Cal team, Justin Wilcox returns as their head coach off a disappointing defensive season by his standards, but there is a little bit of reason for optimism because when you look at this Cal team that had been synonymous with 17-13 football games over the last handful of years, recruiting is trending up. Returning production is headed in the right direction. And Payne, while they're going to go through life in the ACC with a new offensive coordinator, there is some optimism in Berkeley that they may have a quarterback that they can lean on. And even if he flounders, arguably one of the deepest, more underrated quarterback rooms in the entire conference.
Yeah, I'm with you there. Digging into Mike Bloch a little bit, was with Cal last year, promoted to full-time offensive coordinator. And if you kind of look at his pedigree over the years, it's been a focus on the O-line, the run game. When he was at North Texas, had one of the most efficient rushing attacks in the entire country a few seasons ago. So when you got a guy like Jaden Ott and a pretty deep running back room, Cal's going to be a run-first RPO offense, I think, in neutral game states. You look at Ott, I mean, I'm a little surprised he didn't get plucked by one of the big boys. Just an absolute efficiency monster. He's probably going to be overworked a little bit. Had a 29% usage rate last season, which is a pretty big number there. He can do it all, right? Hit the home run. He breaks tackles, falls forward. Last 2 seasons, Ott has forced 108 missed tackles. That's third most among Power 5 running backs. He's also a threat in the pass game. O-line is probably where there's some improvement here. And again, that's Bloch's like calling card. So on paper, it looks like Cal has more depth at that position than they've had in years. You got a nice road grader there in Vadakani. TJ Sessions is a good right tackle. They're moving Matthew Wyckoff to center. You also added some transfers to that O-line group as well. Will McDonald brings experience from Coastal Carolina, 850 snaps there the last 2 seasons. You have Nick Morrow. It's kind of been the talk of the town. Went from a gray shirt freshman last year to a starting left tackle after putting on 50 pounds in 12 months. You got to figure out what that regimen looks like there, Todd.
That's a lot of in and out. I'm not sure my frame could take on 50 pounds regardless of what I was eating and a potential strength training regimen. That's a hell of a lot of mass to put on a little frame like me.
So I think it's real possible we see improvement from the O-line group there with the depth, and just, when your OC has a clear focus for that position, it's a positive. There's competition at quarterback, which you mentioned. We saw Fernando Mendoza kind of got thrown in the fire last year against Oregon State. He was electric the final 3 quarters of that game, finished with a positive .41 EPA per pass.
Not to be confused with Yankee great Ramiro Mendoza, by the way.
Yeah, this kid's actually from Miami. He was a 3-star kid. He struggled putting the ball in harm's way. 15 turnover-worthy throws in 8 games. Struggled under pressure in a big way. But he was solid when he was kept clean. Showed well with the deep ball. He also added 15 pounds this offseason. But the competition is Chandler Rogers, transfers in from North Texas. He's familiar with Bloch's system, having those 2 guys right at North Texas together. I think Rogers is clearly jumping up in class, but he was uber efficient last year. He's the more veteran quarterback. Turnover-worthy play rate and ability under pressure are substantially better than Mendoza. I think the competition probably carries over well into fall, but the vibe is Rogers is leading right now. Wide receiver room is kind of in search for an alpha, but there is some nice depth there. You have Tron Grizel, came out of nowhere last season. He's moving from the slot to outside. Cal brought in 4-star transfers in Tobias Merriweather from Notre Dame. Brad will probably have a little bit of a better opinion on him than me, but he's got great size. Had a nice touchdown grab in the spring game. Mikey Matthews from Utah rolled the dice on Keon Gray's, a former top 65 guy in the 2022 class from Ohio State. Word is, the receiver room is substantially faster year over year. I'm expecting more downfield shots there, some deep crossers. If you listen to, the quarterback Chandler Rogers kind of talk during the spring game, he's like, my favorite throw is the deep post. So I would expect more of that from Cal. What's interesting is, like, from a talent and power rating standpoint, we have Cal a better team, especially on offense year over year. The schedule is difficult, though. We have 5 top 40 defenses on the schedule. We don't project a single FBS opponent to have a defense outside the top 100. Cal has to play FSU, Miami, NC State, 3 of the top 4 teams in the ACC. You have the tough out-of-conference game traveling to Auburn. You have unfamiliar treks, right, to Pittsburgh and Wake Forest and SMU. And, thinking about Cal's schedule a little bit outside the box, I think they'd love if the road games on the schedule were against Oregon State, Stanford, and San Diego State, since time zones are the same. All the trips to different time zones for Cal this season are spread out, right? You have 2 in September, 1 early, 1 late. There's 1 in the middle of October. There's 2 in November, 1 early, 1 late. So it's not like Cal can stay on the East Coast back-to-back weeks, which kind of know, like, NFL organizations have found successful through their travel studies. So there's some real quirkiness to the layout of the schedule on top of the difficulty for Cal.
You mentioned some of the receiver transfers, and Brad, I feel this is a good segue before we get into your take on what Cal will look to do to improve on the defensive side of the ball. Tobias Merriweather spent time at Notre Dame. We saw a little bit of his big play ability. He was a West Coast kid transferring home. Do we feel maybe slightly more familiar surroundings will give him a chance to flourish in this offense under Mike Bloch?
I'm not there yet. Obviously, I think the kid has all the physical attributes. Just never was able to put it together at Notre Dame. Certainly felt like it was more mental than anything. Had some drop issues. Never really took off. Maybe now that he's back familiar on the West Coast, expectations aren't as high for him. The Notre Dame wide receiver room probably expected a little too much out of him, at least early on in his career, than what he probably was comfortable with. I'm not there yet. I just haven't seen it. I know he had a decent spring game. I know they're counting on him, but he had too many mental mistakes for me to slam my fist on the table and say, hey, he has the ability to be a go-to guy.
That's fair. They're going to need, to your point, Payne, someone to step up and try and give them the weapons, knowing that quarterback play doesn't appear to be at least a concern heading into fall camp. But when we talk about Cal and Justin Wilcox, it's always been defense as their calling card, Brad. Peter Syrman, the defensive coordinator, is tasked with the rebuild for a group that allowed nearly 38 points per game in the Pac-12. Can't possibly be as porous again this year if they're going to expect to compete. Gave up 30 passing touchdowns and over 280 yards per game through the air. But the one area where they did excel, they shared the FBS lead with 28 takeaways, and Syrman, during spring practice, was quoted as saying, I think it was a culmination of a lot of things. We weren't as disruptive as we need to be in the front seven with tackles for loss and negative yardage plays. We had, I thought, some sack opportunities that we just didn't finish. Is the reason to believe that Cal can turn some of that pressure into sacks and be a little bit more disruptive to get them to that 6-7 win threshold?
Yeah, I think so. I'm confident that we'll see a little bit of regression. Is Cal going to go back to what they were a couple years ago defensively as one of the better defensive teams in the now defunct Pac-12? No, I don't think they're there yet, but they're certainly not as bad as what they showed last year. I mean, this is a Cal defense that didn't even rank in the top 100 in total defense. Scoring defense was 114th in the country, and obviously Wilcox cut his teeth on the defensive side of the ball. And for a long time, I know West Coast football or anything pretty much west of the Mississippi doesn't get covered that much. But legitimately one of the better defensive minds west of the Mississippi for a long period of time. So I got to think that they'll be better and figure some things out. I think that they really, going back to the offense, I think, they went a little bit more up-tempo. They focused a little bit more on the offense last year. I think, in turn that hurt the defense. They faced more plays. They didn't adjust to it that well. One thing that they didn't adjust to at all was their schedule in conference last year. I mean, this was a team that gave up 38 points per game in conference, over 300 passing yards per game, if you think those are just numbers. If we extrapolated that towards the full season, we're talking about the worst defense in the country. Didn't help that you faced Caleb Williams, Michael Penix, Bo Nix. Those three alone put up 57 points per game on this Cal defense. So I know we're talking schedule, and I agree with Payne. It is a tougher schedule. I hate the fact that they have to play Auburn and Florida State on the road in September. But the fact that they're not facing Caleb Williams, Michael Penix, Bo Nix from the quarterback position tends to make me believe that the schedule, at least from opposing passing offenses, is going to allow this Cal pass defense to be better this year. You mentioned the turnovers. The Cal football, watching it last year, was just one big turnover fest, offensively and defensively. I think they'll be able to get a little bit more pressure on the quarterback this year. Personnel says that they should be. Let's start up front. Ricky Correa, just looks like a guy that shouldn't be playing at Cal. He's 6'4", 335 pounds. Just looks completely different than any other body type they have on that front. This Xavier Carlton kid started off at Utah. He's been productive for them, 4.5 sacks. David Reese is a guy maybe some people that follow the state of Florida know. He was originally a Gator. Another body type that just doesn't look like anybody else on that Cal roster. He was productive last year in returns. He had 6.5 sacks. They love this kid at linebacker, this Uluave kid. He was the Pac-12 Defensive Freshman Player of the Year. He returns. They got a couple guys in the secondary that at least were productive, led by Craig Woodson. So there are some pieces to work with there, despite the fact they lost their top two tacklers. I like the coaching continuity that Wilcox has been there forever. His buddy Peter Syrman's now in his fourth year is the sole defensive coordinator. He's been on staff the whole time. And one thing we haven't mentioned yet, and I kind of got onto this last year, and I was particularly high on Cal than just about anybody last year. Whoever is controlling the scouting department, particularly the transfer portal, is really good, really underrated, because they have the ability to find some guys that I'm not going to put it up with Mike Norvell of Florida State, but they got 3 FCS transfers, all conference players, all 3 of them, that they're going to plug into this defense. And I think sometimes these FCS transfers that, I know they're making a significant step up as far as competition, but when you're all league and you're all league for multiple years and they're not asking you to be an every down player, but just find a role on third down or whatnot, I think Cal, at least the last 2 years, has done about as good of a job as anybody in the country. So I'm a little bit up on this Cal defense.
This will be a Bears team that'll get challenged week in, week out, a little bit different dynamic for all the reasons that you guys outlined, talking about some of the travel, how that can wear down these rosters, and we'll inevitably be looking for opportunities to buy and sell accordingly, with a team hailing from the West Coast making multiple trips across multiple time zones on a somewhat regular basis throughout the course of the campaign. From Cal, just trying to keep themselves afloat in the ACC, to a team who's got aspirations of winning the league title in the Clemson Tigers. And when we look at Clemson, gentlemen, their win total sits at 9.5, heavily shaded to the under. Conference title odds have been on the drift. We saw them open at some prominent shops right around 3-1. That number now closer to 4-1. And when we look at Clemson's schedule, while we can pencil in potentially a loss week 1 against Georgia, where they're right around 2 touchdown dogs, you look at what Clemson will be faced with. It doesn't get much easier in the middle portion of the schedule, with NC State at home, Stanford at Florida State, and things get a little bit tougher later. But this was a team, guys, that started the season 4-4 last year, caught fire down the stretch, and built some momentum. I mean, they failed to win 10 games as a program for the first time in a dozen seasons. When you look at Clemson, the big overarching storyline, as always, can Dabo Swinney keep this program relevant, given his reluctance or flat-out refusal to lean into the transfer portal and address some of the positions of need that they can't necessarily fill throughout the course of traditional high school recruiting. And Brad, when we look at this offense for Clemson, I think Cade Klubnik, we saw highs and we saw lows. His ball security oftentimes left a lot to be desired. We saw flashes of what he can be in terms of an athlete running the football, but they never really allowed him to throw the ball downfield and take advantage, albeit with very limited weapons. There's a lot more optimism about some of the weapons that they have in tow this year, whether it's Phil Moffitt taking over as a true number 1 back, the addition of a player like Brian Wesco, that people are calling the most talented receiver to set foot on campus since DeAndre Hopkins. When you look at year 2 of the Garrett Riley experience, are you buying Clemson offensively taking the next step forward?
Yeah, I am. So I did upgrade Clemson's offense. Let's first talk last year. It certainly did not meet the high expectations. I'll give Payne credit. Not that his ego needs to get any bigger, but he was the one guy. Everyone was talking.
20 minutes in and you're pumping the guy's tires after he took the entire summer off to go travel the world or whatever the hell he did?
I gotta give him his flowers on this one, because even myself, we're buying the Garrett Riley hype last year, and it just never came together. I mean, the team, just look at basic counting stats. I mean, number 52 in yards per total offense, 52 in scoring, and more importantly, what they struggled with, two areas. Number one, they couldn't generate big plays. Number 98th in the country in yards per play. And then when they did get down in the end zone, we saw it right away in the Duke game. I mean, turnovers in the red zone. Could move the football between the 20s methodically, but when it came down to making plays where it mattered most, just could not do it on a consistent basis. And speaking of consistency, there was a lot of inconsistency. I mean, if you go back through their games, rewatch them, big reason why they didn't win the Miami and NC State games. They literally had no running game whatsoever. And then they had 3 other games during the course of the season where they were basically, if you look at them statistically on the passing side, look like a triple option team, averaging barely over 100 yards passing per game. So just we're not able to put it all together. And really, even in the 5-game win streak down the stretch, that there was bits and pieces of games where they didn't put it together. I mean, look no further than the bowl game. Struggled the first 3 quarters, and then all of a sudden it was like, when they had to need 3 drives at the end to score, or they're going to lose to Kentucky, they find that ability to score 3 times in the fourth quarter against the Wildcats that led them to the win there. Let's talk personnel. Obviously, a lot of people are going to focus on quarterback Klubnik. I think his biggest problem is Clemson fans still remember 2 generational type quarterbacks in Deshaun Watson and Trevor Lawrence, and the reality is DJU and Cade Klubnik are not those 2 guys. They are not Deshaun Watson. They are not Trevor Lawrence, and I know there was a lot of expectations for Klubnik because those 2 guys, proved it and started showing signs as a sophomore that they were the guy. Klubnik had bits and pieces, but on the whole, disappointing season to say the least. You mentioned the turnovers. I'll mention turnovers because you're looking for a guy to take that next step. I know spring games can be hit or miss, but I watched the Clemson spring game, and I watched him have 2 really bad turnover-worthy plays, in the first half of it, and it just does not look like he had turned that corner yet. I know in a very limited sample size there, but man, if you're heading into your junior season and you got all that experience, you are not making a couple of those throws. I don't care if it's practice, a spring game, you're playing an FCS team, you're playing Florida State on the road, you can't make those throws for Klubnik. So I still have some doubts there. Let's talk running back, Maffa. You mentioned it, going to be more of a bell cow with Will Shipley gone. We saw at the end of last year, he's perfectly capable of being a bell cow. Now, I'm not sure that he can do it all 12 games, but in a pretty high leverage game where they didn't have anything really else going on offense, I mean, Maffa had 35 carries against Notre Dame and had 186 yards. He was the only back to put up such numbers against a Notre Dame defense last year. So I like Maffa quite a bit there. We'll see if they can find a backup running back that can spell him from time to time. You mentioned the wideouts, and I think that this is the reason why I put a big upgrade on Clemson's offense this year. They just weren't healthy last year. This is a wide receiver room that, they relied on Tyler Brown last year, who was their lowest rated incoming true freshman. He led the team in receiving last year. So, you could say, hey, kudos for Tyler Brown, but I think it was more to say about how bad that receiving room was. Much guys didn't stay healthy, to say the least, led by Antonio Williams, who's probably, at least coming into last season, at least at the start of the season, was expected to be their guy. Just wasn't healthy, missed 5 games. Provided he's healthy this year, should be better. I like this Adam Randall kid's a big body. He's probably more tight end than wide receiver at 6'4", 220. Just at least gives him a bigger body type. Speaking of tight end, I do like their tight end, Brenningstool. I think is a legitimate receiving threat there. And then I think some legitimate optimism, is a pair of true freshmen, a 5-star caliber type players. Bryant Wesco, TJ Moore. TJ Moore really stood out. You can make a case that he might have been the best player at the U.S. Army All-American game back in January. And then you go to spring practice, and Wesco looks like he's going to be the true freshman, instant impact wide receiver. I've even had some coaches say he's their best wide receiver they've had in the last 4 or 5 years, regardless of that he's only a true freshman. So a lot of optimism there, at least at the receiving position, provided they stay healthy. Speaking of health, they didn't have health at offensive line. They had several starters out at the end of the season, despite the fact they were able to win 5 games down the stretch. 4 starters back, so at least from a returning production aspect, I prefer to have 4 starters back than 1 on the offensive line. And, just so happens that their best guy's back in Blake Miller. And I like their offensive line. I pay attention to offensive line coaching hires. I like Matt Luke. I don't like Matt Luke as a head coach at Ole Miss. I don't think that was not a great, certainly out of his realm of capability. But I do like Matt Luke focused on one position group, the offensive line. So I thought that was a sneaky good hire by Dabo. So all in all, even though the schedule isn't going to be very forgiving right off the bat, I don't know if the offense shows a lot of its success against that Georgia defense in the opener. But I do think we're going to see a little bit more consistency from this Clemson offense in year 2 under Riley.
Be interesting to see if they can take what they learned in the latter portions of last season. You mentioned increased health, a little bit overall upgrade in terms of skill position talent, to see if Cade Klubnik can make some of those better decisions and show some of the maturation that so many Clemson fans are hoping to see year over year. But Payne, for all the questions that we have about Clemson offensively, last year their defense was able to carry the torch and deserved a ton of credit for some of the success they had as well. Now, the stop unit does lose a lot from last year's edition that finishes a top 10 grouping under Wes Goodwin's leadership. The scheme should typically remain the same as it always does, aggressive, blitz-happy approach. 5 players from last year's group were drafted. They lost a couple of members of this defense to the transfer portal. Barrett Carter returning becomes a big win for Clemson and arguably one of the best NFL prospects on the defensive side of the ball. TJ Parker saying all the right things, Xavier Woods. But one of the areas of concern for Clemson, at least on paper right now, has to be a young, inexperienced secondary that's going to be tested right out of the gates. When you look at Clemson defensively, what are some of your expectations coming into the 2024 campaign?
I think Brad hit the offense perfectly in that maybe some improved offense takes some of the onus off the defense a little bit here, and that becomes a positive. We mentioned Wes Goodwin in our preview the season he took over for Brent Venables, and I think all the intel we had from his stop with the Arizona Cardinals has been proven true. He's created a very nice baseline for success. He's still learning on the job, right? He's in his 30s. Clemson recruits defense extremely well. It develops talent well. So it's not all about the 5 stars, but there's gobs of young talent that are difference makers already. Peter Woods and TJ Parker, who you mentioned. We'll see if Sammy Brown can be that third guy at some point this season. But it also looks like 2 3-star guys in the Tigers secondary with Khalil Barnes and Avion Terrell are hits. You have veterans to complement the young talent with Barrett Carter, who you mentioned, and R.J. Mickens. But I do question some of the depth at certain positions, and also like that next tier of player that's been in Clemson's program a few years, that's bided their time, that showed well in small sample sizes, but are now going to be relied on to play like true starter snaps, right? Wade Woodaz, Peyton Page, DeMonte Capehart, right? Can they play to the level they did in those small sample sizes now that they're going to be asked to play 400, 500, 600 snaps? Clemson's defense returns only a shade more than 55% of production, and that's specifically relevant for a program that refuses to add talent via the portal. The strategy doesn't make sense now, but I will be honest. I think if we go to a system where the NCAA pays its players as employees, and that's certainly getting closer to happening than people think, it's a discussion for a different day, Dabo may come out the other side looking like a genius. The floor for this Clemson defense is extremely high. There really isn't, a worry that Clemson won't churn out another top 25 unit, but I do worry about the ceiling because of the premium talent that left. And I think some of, the depth concerns I mentioned. Jeremiah Trotter Jr. may have limitations athletically at the NFL level, but he was the quarterback of Clemson's defense for years. And, I really like the linebacker room with Carter and Sammy Brown and Wade Woodaz and even Kobe McLeod. But, Tyler Davis and Nate Wiggins were both drafted. Those are 2+ players. Trotter, again, drafted. Those 3 were basically Clemson's top 4 graded defenders from a season ago. You had Rook, who was the 35th pick in the NFL draft. Xavier Thomas is a bit polarizing, right, because he didn't have the career that met expectation because of injuries, but he led the team in pressures last season, 15% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. You got Andrew Makuba. Right, he was a starting safety. He was the leader in the secondary, transferred to Texas for the bigger bag and to be closer to home. Clemson fans are kind of lukewarm on Toriano Pride, but he was likely a starter alongside Barnes once Makuba left. At minimum, Pride was going to be like a 300-400 snap guy in the Stafey rotation with Mickens and Griffin. He transferred to a better conference. Some of your concerns at corner are very warranted there, Todd. You have Jaden Lucas, a former top 40 player, or Tavoy Fagan, a true freshman, kind of battling it out for a starting corner spot. Lucas is in year 3, hasn't graded above an average player in his 270 snaps. Tavoy Fagan had the nice pick that Brad referenced on a miscommunication between Klubnik and one of his receivers, and then the very next possession dropped another interception that Klubnik threw right to him. But that's kind of the battle for the corner number 2 spot. He's a true freshman, right? So there's questions there, and the depth in the secondary concerns me a little bit, and God forbid, in an attrition sport, Peter Woods or TJ Parker misses time, because then you question, the premium talent that's ready to contribute. And the defense, to Brad's point you mentioned there, has got to hit the ground running. It's Georgia week 1, easily a top 5 offense. No layup for Clemson's defense week 2 with App State, right? You're thinking, App State, that's probably a top 5 G5 offense or so. Brad can correct me if I'm wrong there. We'll get to them shortly, but we're a little bit higher than market on NC State's offense, Stanford's offense, FSU. I know Brad threw a little shot there at DJU, but that's likely a top 20-ish type offense again. So that's the first 5 weeks of the season for this Clemson defense. And you're kind of transitioning defensively with all those guys leaving. And so, they're going to get tested early. The good thing schedule-wise, 7 games in Death Valley, where the Tigers defense, has got this unruly crowd behind them. But it's certainly tough early for a defense that's facing some transition.
And this is a team, when you look at the betting markets, has taken some under money early on. Mentioned at the top that they've drifted out in terms of their odds to win the conference. And when you look at some of the game of the year numbers at a couple of prominent shops, Clemson has been one of those teams that's been bet against. Not massively, but you've seen half-point moves here and there. So it'll be interesting to see with this group, given how daunting their schedule may be out of the gates, if they're able to navigate through potential troubled waters, or they're going to get derailed much like they did early last season, knowing that it's ACC title and a playoff berth or bust, given some of the disappointment that we saw last year. Want to encourage all of you, our loyal Bet the Board listeners, to follow Brad on Twitter at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me on social media, but most importantly, as always, for all things Bet the Board, be sure to follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And gentlemen, from Clemson to Florida State we go. And when we look at the Seminoles, their win total sits at 9.5. Odds to win the conference have actually shortened from right around 3-1, now in that plus 270 range, plus or minus, of course. Do shop around as always when you're looking at win totals in conference futures. It's the one market, or two markets, I should say, where there's plenty of variability throughout the industry. When we look at Florida State, there's no doubt last year's 13-0 season, a little bit disappointing and anticlimactic given their failure to make the college football playoff. But this is a program that's going to look a little bit different, but now has their eyes set on getting to the ACC title game and trying to join that 12-team college football playoff. All 10 assistants returned to Tallahassee, making continuity a bit of a real strength. They hit the transfer portal and did so aggressively with solid results. Payne mentioned already, as well as Brad, DJU takes over for Jordan Travis under center, so you have a consummate veteran and an adult in the room. And a quote that you love to see if you're making a case for Florida State, picking up right where they left off from Mike Norvell: we had the best 8-week winter program that we've ever had. We had the strongest, fastest team that we've had since I got here. And Payne, when we look at Florida State on the offensive side, group needs to replace not only Jordan Travis, but Keon Coleman, Johnny Wilson, Trey Benson, Jaheim Bell. But they hit the portal well and were able to at least fill on the surface some of those major voids. When you look at Florida State's offense, more of the same from last year or a little bit different philosophy, knowing that DJU's skill set's slightly different than Jordan Travis?
You know, you guys bust balls, and I think some of our listeners maybe believe some of the things that are said, but why we...
They should believe everything that Brad and I say when it comes to busting balls. I'm not here to sugarcoat shit.
I think, when we do these previews, our goal is to provide information, and sometimes when you have a little bit better of an understanding and more of a connection to certain programs, you try to divulge information that people won't hear anywhere else, and I think we'll probably do that here with Florida State. And to your point, like Jordan Travis, Keon Coleman, Trey Benson, Johnny Wilson, and Jaheim Bell won't be easy to replace. And I think outside perception, and we'll immediately think a drastic dip in offensive efficiency is coming here. Maybe there's a search for an offensive identity to a degree early, and things will be fluid. But through the types of players Florida State added this offseason, and an understanding of which position groups are strengths, player strengths and weaknesses, knowing Mike Norvell's track record, Florida State's efficiency isn't going to dip as dramatically as people think. And last year, it was almost like they had too much talent that it was tough to kind of get them to play as one at times. One thing you have to really love about Mike Norvell is, like, when he says something, he means it, right? He runs an offense that's built for playmakers. It's his tagline, but the context of what that actually means is that Norvell is going to design and call an offense that's built to player strengths, right? This isn't, I don't want to take a shot at him, but this isn't a Cliff Kingsbury air raid offense that doesn't change, that only recruits players that fit his system, right? That lacks diversity. That's not Mike Norvell's offense. So right off the bat, I think Florida State will be more run-heavy this season. You're going to see far more multi-back sets. I would think something like 2018 Memphis, when they had Darrell Henderson, Patrick Taylor, Tony Pollard, Antonio Gibson, and Kenny Gainwell, all guys that reached the NFL. So if you look last season, Florida State only used two back sets 11% of the time. That number is going to skyrocket this season with Toa Feely, Roydell Williams, Jalen Lucas, Cam Davis, and Keziah Holmes. Now, it's likely Florida State's going to lose some of its rushing explosiveness without Trey Benson. Last year, 15% of Benson's carries were explosive. But I think Roydell Williams is a shiftier between the tackles runner with great vision that isn't going to have as many negatives and zeros as Benson. The offensive line additions at guard, Richie Leonard from Florida, 335 pounds, played his best ball against the best opponents on the schedule. TJ Ferguson from Alabama, 325 pounds, a guy Alex Atkins wanted out of high school, but Florida State just wasn't in the right place to beat out Alabama for him. Keandre Jones, who's been in the system, 340 pounds. Darius Washington being fully healthy and having a full offseason in the weight room for the first time in 3 seasons. It all lends itself to more running. If Darius Washington stays healthy, this will be Mike Norvell and Alex Atkins' best offensive line in Tallahassee. You're going to see outside zone, a lot of jet sweeps, and throwing with play action. And I think that's where DJU comes in. And I understand he's one of the more polarizing quarterbacks in the country. And I know Mike Norvell made DJU uncomfortable from day one, forcing him to do things he struggled with in the past. Leading up to the season in game situations, Mike Norvell is going to lean into what DJU does best, and you can just tell how he's comprised the roster this season. It's going to fit to DJU. That's being a physical +1 in the box on short yardage, something they didn't really have with Jordan Travis. That's taking care of the football. That's pushing the ball downfield, off play action. Those are things you can expect. Norvell isn't going to ask DJ to be a precision passer and feather the ball into all levels of the field. That's not what he's going to ask him to do.
I was hoping for air raid. I'm a little disappointed now.
If you look at Florida State's offense, it's very much going to be power run, wide receiver screens when defenses crash down too fast in the RPO game, and deep shots. And if you look at DJU's profile, he's a guy that was in the top 20th percentile in average depth of throw last year. He took care of the football in tough situations, top 20th percentile in sack avoidance, interceptions thrown against pressure, and making those downfield throws. DJ was top 20th percentile in boom percentage, which basically is a play that generates at least +1 EPA per play. Receiver room undoubtedly is looking for a leader. I think it's Malik Benson after Destin Hill tore his ACL in spring. That's a tough loss. As great as Keon Coleman, Johnny Wilson, and Jaheim Bell are, they were all 4.6 40 type guys. All 3 were dealing with lower body injuries down the stretch last season. The receiver room lacked speed, and so there was a concerted effort to add that this offseason for when you need more space to run and for when you want to take those deep shots with DJU's howitzer of an arm. Malik Benson runs a 10.4 100 meter. Jalen Lucas and Jalen Brown 10.6. At 6'3", 215, Hakeem Williams at 22 miles per hour on the wide receiver screen against Syracuse last season as a true freshman. So I'm interested to see what fall camp looks like. Last offseason, there was a lot of hype around Kentron Portier. He was the king of the spring. There was circus catches in the spring game. He ended up battling injuries all season. Florida State needs that version of Kentron to return. I think the receiver room has a chance to look a little better in fall camp just by getting used to the way DJU throws. His ball is just coming at you with velocity, whereas Jordan Travis threw a very feathery, catchable ball, so there's a lot of drops in spring. Tight end room is a clear question mark. Kyler Morlock has to be a 4-star tight end that virtually every big team coveted in the 2023 portal class. Jackson West has to stay healthy. He's more of a blocking tight end, fights the ball a bit as a pass catcher. What's interesting here is Mike Norvell didn't take anybody in this room, which was thought to be the case. He wants to let Landon Thomas grow. Thomas was a 5-star number 1 tight end in this past class. He was committed to Georgia. Once Thomas flipped to FSU and chose not to attend any of the recruiting services all-star games, he suddenly became the 11th best tight end in the country. I can tell you the staff feels they hit on Landon Thomas. Let's see what this looks like in the 5 months from spring to September, but they are kind of all in on Landon Thomas. Schedule is interesting here. FSU only plays 3.5 true road games this season. All of the offensive parts have a chance to grow early in the season with Georgia Tech, BC, Memphis, and Cal the first 4 games. I do agree with Brad, though, that Cal's defense is going to look substantially better there. But none of those 4 defenses for us project better than 70th this season. At SMU, certainly going to be tricky ahead of hosting Clemson. At Notre Dame will be a bear, knowing the Irish are off a bye and FSU's toughest part of their schedule leads up to Notre Dame. Let me just kind of put this out there, and this will piss off Florida State fans, I'm sure. Florida State is not a national title contender this season. 2023 was the all-in year. I think a good 2024 season is winning 9 games, accumulating the 10th in a bowl game. FSU's peak season is winning the conference, sneaking into the college football playoff, and praying they avoid Georgia or Ohio State or Oregon. Now, I never underestimate this staff's ability to develop and get the most out of players. That is their elite trait. So what some of these young kids looked like in March and April won't be what they look like in September. There's a handful of guys that have to step up along with, young upside guys. that would need to pop simultaneously for FSU's peak to be realized, right? Kyle Morlock, Malik Benson, Akeem Williams, Blake Nicholson, Conrad Hussey. Those guys have to reach levels that we haven't quite seen yet to think about the college football playoff, in my mind.
I mean, you lost me after you described Jordan Travis throwing a soft, feathery ball that had images of Chad Pennington flowing through my head, knowing that they'll both be donning Jets green.
Yeah, baby.
In the fall to be able to set that up. But when you look at that Florida State offense, I think what blew me away, Payne, just from a counting stat standpoint, from rushing output-wise, that was the worst Mike Norvell team running the football since 2016 when he was at Memphis. And it never really felt like that when you watch Florida State in their games, that they struggled to get things going on the ground, but down to your point, sometimes offered a lot to be desired, but they did show that big play potential. We'll see exactly what the offense looks like this year. Now, on the other side of the ball, Brad, we will keep Payne's thoughts on Adam Fuller as defensive coordinator to himself. This will be your opportunity to share your perspective on what you expect to see from a Florida State defense, that there is a lot more optimism, that there won't be a drop-off year over year from what they saw. Hit the portal, address some of their concerns. No linebacker is a question that they're going to have to answer sooner rather than later. But when you look at the defensive line, you look in the secondary, a lot of things to be excited about for the Florida State Seminoles in 2024.
There is. I do have a slight downgrade from the defense because, you are talking about a defense that lost 5 guys of the draft, a lot of elite players, but generally speaking, for a variety of reasons, tough to get a grasp on a very solid Florida State power rating. First, obviously, when you start with the power rating for the upcoming season, you look at the previous year with the prior. And why is it tough? Well, this was a Florida State defense. A majority of their top frontline players were on snap counts, especially on the defensive line. When your top guys are only playing 50% of the snaps, do we really know how elite they were? Because I got to tell you, I think last count, I'm approaching 500 games I've watched from last season, and if I'm just breaking down what individual position group performances, I would say the Florida State defensive line against Florida and Louisville was as good as I saw any unit on any team play in any game last year. That's how, when they turned it on and cut Braden Fisk and Jared Verse-Loose and Patrick Payton and all those guys on that defensive front, that was elite. And also possibly a missed opportunity to make some money on that defense being able to, in a playoff game. Obviously, if Jordan Travis was healthy, maybe would have turned into a big bet in a playoff semifinal. I digress there. I didn't want to sadden Payne too much there. But so, with the limited snap counts, tough to get, how good they really were, because if you look at the counting stats from last year, it says it was a good defense. I mean, they're right around the top 25 yards per play, yards per game scoring. Obviously, the Georgia game was such an outlier, 60-plus points, 600-plus yards. That's factored into it. You almost got to take that out. But let's talk this year. There are certainly a lot. You mentioned it. There's a lot to like. At least maybe not as much depth as what they had a year ago, but man, their starting 11 has the potential to be a top 10 caliber defense. Let's start up front. I like Joshua Farmer up front, very productive player. Obviously on the edge, Patrick Payton has been a productive player each of his first 2 years. Those two alone combined for 12 sacks and more than 20 tackles for loss last year. What I like about Payton is this year he's put on 15 pounds. I expect him to be able to handle playing more snaps this year. So I like that. A name you need to know up front, and a name you need to know, forget just the ACC, a name you need to know nationally is Marvin Jones Jr. If I'm stack ranking, impact transfers that aren't getting enough publicity, Marvin Jones Jr. would be maybe at the top of the list. I expect him to play, up to his 5-star billing like he was coming out of high school. He originally went to Georgia. I don't expect him to play maybe as well as his dad did in the 1992 season, where his dad was a linebacker at Florida State and finished top 5 in the Heisman Trophy. But I do expect him to be a first-team All-ACC type of player off the edge. They're very excited about him. Darrell Jackson's been a guy that if he has his head on straight, he's from Miami. Was he going to transfer out last year? I mean, this is a kid that's 6'5", 334 pounds, and if his head's on straight, he can be an all-ACC type of performer. All 4 guys, and they play up to their potential as far as the starters up front, can be first or second team all-ACC. So I really like them up front. I don't like them, particularly at linebacker. Although, I know they lost their top 2 guys from last year. It's not like Bethune and Deloach were all Americans. I mean, I would say that was the weakness of last year's defense was linebacker. So, typically maybe I would downgrade a team significantly for losing their top 2 guys at that position. I'm not, because I wasn't big fans of Bethune and Deloach to begin with. Another position group, even though I think the linebacker is probably the weakness and a question mark, I do like, obviously what's in front of that position group, and I also like what's behind that position group as far as the secondary goes. I know they lose Renardo Green in the second round of the draft, but Cypress, second year in the system at cornerback, the Virginia transfer, I like, he's an all-ACC type of player. They are super high, Adam Fuller is, on Thomas at cornerback. He was the most improved player in the spring, graded out at like a 98, 99 percentile in the spring. Fuller loves his secondary, watching him on tape. The Florida State spring game, you don't always get a good look. I'll tell you what I did get a good look is, not to digress too much, but my God, that stadium is like demolished. I asked Payne, I'm like, is that stadium going to be done in a couple months? I mean, they tore it completely down on one side. That was something that was very noticeable. What was also noticeable was the length of the Florida State secondary. I mean, in today's day and age of college football, I like 6'1" type corners, and Florida State's got a ton of guys in the secondary. Conrad Hussey at safety is a guy that was very highly regarded coming out of high school. Played some limited snaps last year, around 200. But, you look at his production in those 200 snaps, very good. If you extrapolate that to 600 snaps this year, he's an all-ACC type of player. I mean, they're not there yet as far as recruiting at a national title level consistently, high school recruiting. And by that, I mean consistent top 5, top 10 classes. But obviously, they hit home runs in the portal. They do they hit the transfer portal as well as anybody in the country, and not just acquiring a bunch of name players and whatnot. Legitimate scouting and players that can fit this personnel. So they're not as deep as last year, and I agree with Payne's overall assessment. This isn't a national title team, but my goodness, I mean, I think they're probably right now the best team in the ACC. So. That's saying a lot. I do think it's a little tough to power rate them, and I'm seeing confliction in the market because, I mean, I saw a couple shops open their win total at 9. I told Payne, I'm like, that's too low. I think 10 is so much more likely than 8 and 4. So I'm involved there. But, man, in the game of the year markets, I think Florida State's probably priced too high. I mean, a 3-point favorite at Miami, only a 3-point underdog at Notre Dame and South Bend in a tough spot. So there's kind of conflictions. Is this a top 15 team? Is this a top 10 team? I don't know yet. I do think the potential is there for them to be a top 10 team when it's all said and done.
I'm just circling my calendar, November 9th, to watch you boys go toe-to-toe. Hopefully there's plenty at stake when we can get Payne in the red corner, Brad fighting from the blue corner for Florida State's trip to South Bend to get things going. And, Brad, the reality of it is that if Payne's check would have cleared, they would have been able to finish his construction at Doak Campbell Stadium well in advance. So he's withholding payment, apparently, to get them back where they need to be until the ACC lawsuit is officially resolved.
Well, first of all here, boys, first guy through the wall always gets bloody, but there's a reason Clemson came on board that lawsuit about 4 weeks later. So we're going to be out of there pretty quickly. The stadium is going to hold about 55,000 this year. Next year, I would assume it's back around 70,000. So something potentially a little bit higher level to think about when you are pricing some home field advantage in for the Seminoles this year.
I didn't even know there were that many people that lived in the Panhandle down there to fill that building. But see, you learn something new every day to try and figure out where the program is going. But no doubt, Florida State, clearly a program on the rise that has some stability at the coaching position over the last handful of years. Georgia Tech, gentlemen, when we look at the Yellow Jackets and the Rambling Wreck, their win total, 5.5, shaded to the under in that $1.60-ish range. They are 100-1 to win the conference. And when we look at Georgia Tech from a schedule perspective, at Syracuse on September 7th, could become a massive swing game in Georgia Tech's overall season outlook. We know they'll get things kicked off in week 0. Across the Atlantic Ocean against the Florida State Seminoles. We look at the last 6 weeks for Georgia Tech. Hell, you can look at the whole season. This is a team that's going to have their work cut out for them more often than not. The Yellow Jackets scheduled to face 11 teams who made bowl games last season. Amongst that group, Georgia and Notre Dame as well. As far as non-conference games are concerned, they have upgraded their overall recruiting profile, though, as a program trending in the right direction. But Payne, when we look at Florida State offensively, I mean, this is a group, Georgia Tech offensively, a group that returns a lot of
You are a Florida State homer.
Haynes King back under center, running back Jamal Haynes back to try and replicate his 1,000-yard season, leading receiver Eric Singleton. Can Georgia Tech get back to the same lofty heights that we saw last year amongst co-OCs Buster Faulkner and Chris Weinke, knowing how difficult this schedule looks on paper for Coach Pry's bunch?
Chris Weinke, baby. It's a good question. I think Haynes King outperformed expectation last year. Certainly, he had gobs of talent coming out of high school, and when you're a dual threat and in the college football environment, I mean, it just allows an offense to do so much more. All the talk this offseason internally is about cleaning up Haynes King's game and limiting some turnovers, and I think that's clearly fair. But he had some very poor turnover luck. 16 of his 18 turnover-worthy throws were actually picked off last season. Does need to improve the accuracy. Among 165 qualifying quarterbacks, King was 101st in adjusted accuracy. You look at some of the intermediate throws, he's in the bottom 50 percentile there. He does do a fantastic job avoiding negative plays with his legs. Only 10% of pressures he faced turned into sacks. He actually needs to make plays with his arm and attack the attacker better when those situations happen. 112th in big-time throw rate when pressured. You have to make a defense pay when they're sending pressure and don't actually get home. Running back room is interesting because Jamal Haynes came out of nowhere last season. He flipped from receiver to running back in camp and then went on to be a 1,000-yard rusher. 3.4 yards a rush after first contact. Great threat to catch the ball out of the backfield, obviously as a former wide receiver. Low center of gravity, so he just doesn't take big hits for a back that's 5'8". I don't see a ton behind Haynes, though, in terms of depth. Another massive surprise last season was Eric Singleton, a true freshman, leading the team in receiving, averaged 2.4 yards per route run, led all receivers with 6 touchdowns. Versatile guy that can line up outside or inside. Malik Rutherford is wide receiver 2. He has experience. He's improved each of his first 3 seasons. Very sure-handed. If you watch the spring game, the first catch is this one-handed miraculous grab. He's only had 2 drops and 108 career targets. Past those 2, it is really questionable wide receiver room. I think Tech needs Abdul Jannah to make that leap. He's the one guy that's different than the aforementioned Singleton and Rutherford, right, who are much smaller. Jenna is 6'4", big wingspan, can play outside, so he's got to have that big year. O-line is in great shape experience-wise, and this is obviously Brent Key's calling card. He was well-respected offensive line coach under Nick Saban at Alabama, and so that seems to be a unit that plays better than the individual parts. Weston Franklin and Jordan Williams had really nice seasons last year. Joe Fasili made a huge leap as a sophomore. I will kind of throw a disclaimer here with Georgia Tech's offensive line. And we talked about mobile quarterbacks being the efficiency cheat code. So inherently, when you have a guy like Haynes King who runs for over 800 yards and 7 a carry and, is this EPA demon, and it kind of boosts what your offensive line play truly is. And I mentioned earlier how 31% of the pressures Haynes faced only resulted in a sack 10% of the time. So again, King's mobility making the O-line look better in terms of sacks allowed. To me, kind of higher thought process, what makes Georgia Tech interesting to handicap this season is, from my perspective and perception, is Georgia Tech is, as a team, as a power rating, is a tick better than last season, but the schedule is very difficult. And then I look at Brent Key kind of overachieving in the win-loss column last year, right? Was projected to win 4.5 games. They win 6 in the regular season, then got above 500 with the bowl win against UCF. If Mario Cristobal knows how to call victory formation, right, Georgia Tech wins 5 games. Georgia Tech beats UNC, but they trailed by double digits heading to the fourth quarter. You look at some of the teams on the schedule and when they faced them, I thought Tech was fortunate to get Syracuse late in the year when they had a lame duck coach and a tight end playing quarterback, running Wildcat every single snap. You got Louisville week 1 before the Cardinals defense started to figure some things out. And so, on paper, this is a 7-6 Georgia Tech team in 2023. So I think it gave odds makers a very difficult time pricing them, knowing that, hey, like the team might be a touch better, but some of the wins were a little fraudulent. And now you head into 2024, and the schedule is just downright brutal, right? It's Florida State and Ireland to start the season. It's at Louisville, and Villa's off their bye. It's at North Carolina, who's looking for revenge. It's at a much improved Virginia Tech team. It's at Georgia. You host Miami, and that was one of the most embarrassing moments for Mario Cristobal in his tenure. So he's looking for revenge there after last season's game. Notre Dame gets sandwiched between the two aforementioned road trips to UNC and Va Tech. There's just 5 true home games all season. Specific to the offense, Georgia Tech projects to face 8 of our top 40 defenses, and FSU, Notre Dame, and Georgia all project in the top 15. So, it's unfortunate as a all-encompassing team, the better side of Georgia Tech's team, which is their offense, ends up drawing one of the more difficult defensive schedules in the country.
Well, you mentioned the better side of the team, and that's largely because Tech struggled mightily last year on the defensive side of the ball. And, Brad, we can make the case that the biggest acquisition for Georgia Tech defensively was in the coaching ranks, bringing over Tyler Santucci from Duke, overhauling the defensive staff, and 4 new assistants, trying to get this team headed in the right direction. He's tasked with improving a unit that allowed nearly 30 points a game last fall, 200-plus rushing yards, and look for a slight change in their defensive alignment. Santucci, very good last year with the Duke Blue Devils, getting that group to raise its overall level of play. But when we look at Tech, clearly this is a team that only has one place to go, but up for how porous they were on this side of the ball. A bunch of new faces that are expected to be in the starting 11. But how do you go about assessing Georgia Tech defensively, Brad? Is there reason to be optimistic they can be better? And even if they are better, will it be enough to compete with the grueling schedule that Payne outlined?
Yeah, I don't think so. Obviously, a change was needed, to say the least. When you look at some of the basic stats, when you're number 117th in the country in yards per play, you're 123 in total defense. You are the worst Power 5 rush defense in the country, allowing 221 yards per game. Obviously, they needed a new voice and a new change on that side of the ball. And bring in, like you mentioned, Tyler Santucci from Duke, who's been with Elko. He was just an analyst at A&M when Elko was originally there, and then carried over and got the DC job at Duke the last couple of seasons. I will say this, pure speculation on my part. Why did Mike Elko not take Santucci with him to be the DC at A&M? Those are things, obviously Texas A&M DC better than Georgia Tech defensive coordinator. So Elko brought Santucci with him from A&M to Duke. Why didn't he, take him back with him to A&M? Those are some of the questions I asked myself. But obviously going to have to be an upgrade over what they had last year. But I'm not sure the personnel says it's going to be an upgrade. Let's set the schedule aside for a second. You mentioned a lot of guys gone. Now you can, on one hand, you could say, hey, those guys weren't that good to begin with. So, maybe it's a positive addition by subtraction. But my problem is a couple of the players that I really liked off last year's defense are gone, especially the 2 guys that generally consistently generated the best pass rush, Kennard and Moala, for them combined for 10 sacks, 22 tackles for loss. They're gone. I would say their most disruptive player in the secondary, Jalen King, he was the only guy in the defense that made the first or second team All-ACC. He departs. He had 4 picks, 9 PBUs. He's one of their leading tacklers. He's gone. As far as the guys that are returning that can make possibly a difference, Kyle Eford was kind of a revelation. Wasn't much expected out of him. He led the team in tackles a year ago. Kind of a throwback type player. You can't miss him. He's got that old neck roll and the stuff you'd like to see if you grew up in the 80s and 90s. And what you'd like to see from your middle linebacker.
Just don't start pushing for the return of belly shirts, Brad. No football fan needs those again.
Fair enough. Speaking of belly shirts, definitely don't want to see a belly shirt on the defensive lineman. Zeke Biggers definitely stands out up front. 6'6", 333 pounds. They have a ton of experience on the interior, but again, these guys weren't that good last year. They were the worst Power 5 rushing defense in the country, and these guys are coming back. Can you expect them to all of a sudden make a leap to being a functional defense? I'm not sure that's the case. Defensive end, they like this Kevin Harris kid at rush. He was originally at Alabama, but again, didn't see it. And speaking of not seeing it, my goodness, I watched 50-plus spring games. And there's maybe not a bigger disparity between one unit to the next as far as I'm comparing defense to offense, offense to defense. Such a big gap between Georgia Tech's offense and Georgia Tech's defense. I mean, it didn't matter if the ones were in there, the twos, the threes, the walk-ons, the water boys. Georgia Tech's offense went up and down the field on Georgia Tech's defense consistently. The back seven for Georgia Tech completely lost in the game. They're going to have to rely on some transfers. Warren Burrell looks like a guy from Tennessee that's going to have to start at cornerback for them. I got a lot more questions than answers from personnel, and that's even before you start diving into easily the toughest ACC schedule in the entire conference. So I like the coaching staff. I like the fact that they held on to a lot of their frontline players on offense. That tells me that there's a good culture here. I just think when you're non-conference, Georgia and Notre Dame, two clear-cut top 10 teams, plus a tough ACC schedule and questionable personnel, I don't think the Georgia Tech defense makes a jump.
2 steps forward for Brent Pry in Atlanta to try and restore some of the proud traditions around Georgia Tech, but potentially 1 step back, knowing the defensive shortcomings this roster possesses and the grueling schedule that you boys have done a tremendous job outlining. From the rambling wreck to the Louisville Cardinal, and when we look at Louisville, they, of course, came up just short in the ACC Championship, weren't able to muster much on the offensive side against Florida State. Their win total in Coach Brahm's second season sits at 8.5. 6-1 to win the ACC. And when we look at the schedule for Louisville, the Cardinals will play 6 of their last 10 away from home, including a run of 5 of their last 7, making it worse. You look at a schedule that gets to be significantly more difficult this year than last year, at Clemson, at Notre Dame, plenty of other landmines along the way. When we look at the influx or departures of talent, you always wonder when it's 10 players leaving the program, many of whom had just transferred to Louisville months earlier, including guys like Tyler Barron, safety Wesley Walker, and tailback Penny Boone. Brahm had some positive things to say about the spring, and there's reason to believe that this offense could be a little bit better if Tyler Shuck can stay healthy and get them headed in the right direction. But Brad, when we look at Georgia Tech, tells you how all these teams blend together. Louisville, from top to bottom, I mean, this is a group that's going to look different on the offensive side. You lose your starting quarterback, your top 2 running backs, and most of your receiver production, but there seems to be increased optimism about a player like Chris Bell, asserting himself as a true alpha as the number 1 receiver, what they can do to rebuild in the trenches. And Tyler Shuck, we've talked about it at great detail, whether it was at Oregon or Texas Tech. When this guy's healthy, he's a difference maker, but he seems to be held together by paper mache and bubble gum. Louisville offensively in 2024, what are you expecting from Coach Brahm's bunch?
Yeah, I mean, first knee-jerk reaction would have been like, well, I expect more because it's the second year of Brahm, and obviously that's his side of the ball, which is his expertise. And it's not like they were overwhelming, even though they won 10 games a year ago. The offense was above average, basic counting stats in the 40s as far as yards per play, yards per game, and scoring. But not a lot of guys back, to say the least. Only 4 starters back. They ranked number 100th in the country as far as returning production. You lose a guy like Jack Plummer, a bridge-type player. He's a really good transfer get for Louisville last year because he knew the Brahm offense. He wasn't, going to win you the national championship or the ACC title, but he was functional enough to win you 10 games. Wasn't a difference maker. You mentioned Tyler Shuck, when healthy, can be a difference maker. He certainly looked like it in the spring game. I threw a long touchdown pass on the first play of the game. But you mentioned it. Can he stay healthy? History says no, because he hasn't been able to stay healthy his entire career. We're talking multiple seasons. So, if he stays healthy an entire season, that would be the exception, not the rule, as far as his career is gone. And we got enough of a sample size in his career. We're talking about a year 7 player. They do want more vertical passing game this year. Do they have the personnel to run it? Maybe. Went certainly a lot more transfer portal than high school recruiting. You mentioned Chris Bell should be their go-to guy. They bring in Lacey from South Alabama, a very productive player for the Jags last year, 1,300 yards. Ja'Cory Brooks has a lot of talent, another wide receiver transfer from Alabama. I like their tight end position, to say the least. Mark Redmond, I thought, was one of the best group of 5 tight ends in the country at San Diego State last year. Brom loves this Jamari Johnson kid. I think Jaleel Skinner, can he be an every down tight end? No, with his frame, but my goodness, he can be. You're counting on him to make a couple of receptions a game. Certainly is capable of doing that. And I didn't mind rewatching the tape. Kariski, I thought it stood out. I was rewatching the Miami-Louisville game. He had a pretty decent game in that one. So they're loaded at tight end. Where I'm a little bit down and why I have, at least at the start of the season, downgraded Louisville's offense is if you just look at simple grades, anybody that watches any type of football knows that probably the two top three best players on Louisville's offense last year, running back and wide receiver, they're all gone. Let's start at running back. Their top two guys, Jawar Jordan and Garendo, combined for nearly 2,000 yards rushing last year. 24 touchdowns, super productive, both gone. Their top wide receiver, another good transfer, Jamari Thrash that they got last year, had double the receiving yards as the number 2 guy. He departs. So a lot of production off of last year's offense gone. Donald Chaney, Maurice Turnover look like the replacements at running back. They're fine, but I don't know if they're difference makers like Jordan and Garendo were last year. Offensive line, only 2 guys are back. Their guard, Gonzalez, is probably their best player up front there. They like this Yale transfer at tackle, Jonathan Mendoza. Problem is, if you're grading the offensive line last year, Brian Hudson's probably their best offensive lineman at center. He's gone. So just I know Brom thinks there's more depth on the offensive line. It's just, I got to see it. And this is a very transfer portal heavy team. Second year in a row. I'm a little bit down on the Louisville offense, at least to start the season.
And you can understand that. This is the calling card for Coach Brom. So if this group is going to get to a higher level than what we saw last year, it's got to be with his leadership and play calling abilities. Defensively, Payne, when we look at Louisville, defensive coordinators Ron English and Mark Hagan share responsibilities on that side of the ball, but there's a lot of continuity expected here for a defense that delivered 36 sacks and 21 turnovers last season. They did expect to land a player like Tyler Barron and play a big part in what they want to do defensively. He, of course, flips his commitment to Miami. When we look at the front 7 for Louisville on the defensive side, a lot of reason to be excited when you're headlined by a player in Ashton Gallote and what he can do to disrupt how opposing offenses want to try and attack. You look in the secondary, there's pieces there to be excited about as well. But Louisville defensively, are you more confident in this side of the ball than some of the concerns Brad outlined for what this team will look like offensively?
Listen, I like what their defensive coordinators do, right? Ron English, Mark Hagan. They mix things up. They try to keep offenses off balance. You know, they devise game plans to each opponent. And you kind of see that in something as basic as blitz percentages, right? Like some games, Louisville's blitzing 10%. Other games, it's like, mid-40s. Usually in the bigger games, the blitz rate increases, but you like to have coordinators that scheme to opponent rather than just saying, hey, we're going to do what we do. And that's one thing you do get with Louisville. Now, the top line talent isn't necessarily there, but Louisville's D-line was certainly outstanding last year. It was a stout run defense. They ended up top 20 in the country in line yards allowed and EPA per rush. It is headlined by Ashton Gelati. That is their horse. 18% pass rush win rate, 16% pressure rate on pass rush snaps, but he plays the run as well as anyone too. 6th best run defender among Power 5 defensive ends. I'm a little surprised he didn't come out. Mason Rieger is an efficiency monster. Let's see if that continues in expanded role now that Barron left, who you mentioned. Probably get to him in a little bit here. Thor Griffith is making the leap from the Ivies to the P4 level, but was an elite lineman at that level and has NFL potential. Desmond Tell is a nice space eater and a plus player on the interior. Jordan Garrard comes over from FIU, another space eater. Certainly a massive step up in class, but what's positive is he performed well against the best offenses on FIU's schedule last year when all the focus was on him. So Liberty, nice offense. Western Kentucky, North Texas, we talked about Chandler Rogers transferring to Cal. He was their quarterback. Arkansas were some of Jordan's best games in 2023, so I think there's some hope there as a nice rotational depth piece. Miles Jernigan transfers in from Cal. You added Tramel Logan from USF post-spring. Linebacker group to me has questions. I like TJ Quinn, full-time starter last year, just a solid ACC linebacker. Past Quinn, though, Louisville's basically relying on Stanquan Clark to take the next step. He played a reserve role in 2023 as a freshman, but he is a 4-star kid out of Miami that is going to be relied upon for 600-plus snaps this season. Depth is my concern. You got Dan Foster, who couldn't get on the field any of his 3 seasons at Marshall, found a full-time role at Texas State last year and played below an average player. Louisville is Geronte Davis's 4th school in 4 years, right? Played nearly 1,100 snaps between Middle Tennessee State and Jackson State. Average linebacker at that level. Transfers to Texas A&M last year and, couldn't even sniff the grass. So it's basically Quinn and Clark have to stay healthy or Louisville is in trouble at linebacker. Secondary is set up for success even after losing a 5th-round pick in Jarvis Brownlee. Quincy Riley, to me, is a dog, right? You look at him, he only allowed a 36% completion rate when targeted last year. He's a willing tackler from the corner position as well. Corey Thornton transfers in from UCF. I know UCF was not happy about that. He was a 4-year starter there with great production for his career. He's only allowed 55% of targets to be caught. And again, another willing tackler, which is rare from the corner position this day and age. He had an 8% missed tackle rate on nearly 2,500 career snaps for Thornton. Devin Neal has nice versatility at safety. So that's a damn good trio to me. They added 3 more Power 5 transfers to that room as well. I think this is really a tough team to gauge, and my guess is if you were looking at Louisville 2-3 months ago, your power rating was probably much higher. Unfortunately for Louisville's defense, their ceiling was shortened. To me, this is going to be another good defense, but basically a bad acting agent dwarfed this defense's and team's upside. You lost Jermaine Lowell in a bidding war between, bitter rivals, Oklahoma and Texas. I wouldn't blame the kid, right? This is his prime earning year for football, and when so many teams needed defensive tackles, the prices went up 3x this offseason for a defensive tackle. You lost defensive end, 4-star transfer Tyler Barron after spring ball. He leaves Tennessee, actually, and commits to Ole Miss over Texas and Alabama. A month later, leaves Ole Miss, commits to Louisville. A few months later, before ever playing a game, leaves Louisville for Miami. The rumor is Barron was an absolute cancer in the locker room, and he was kicked off the team. He stirred the pot multiple times with NIL, and his specific agent was the bad actor. He's also dealing with an injury that not many people are aware of, so I'll be interested to see his contribution early in the season. Barron's buddy there from Tennessee, Wesley Walker, penciled in to start at free safety for Louisville, leaves, commits to Michigan. Jalen Alderman, linebacker number 2 or 3, depending on who you talk to, was clearly tampered with and transferred out for a bigger bag in late April. So basically, Louisville lost what they deemed to be 4 key contributors on defense in spring. You add the lower ceiling to the fact that Louisville plays a lot of good offenses this season. Right now, we're projecting 4 top 25 offenses on Louisville's schedule, another inside the top 35. And I think Louisville takes a slight step back on defense, but even listening to Brad on the offensive side of the ball, he mentioned the running back room having questions. They fully thought they fixed that with Penny Boone. And then the bad acting agent, right? The bad acting agent, he ends up going to UCF. So I think if you were evaluating Louisville 2.5, 3 months ago, it's going to be much more positive relative to market. Right now, it's a little bit more of a different conversation, I think, with Louisville.
One last thing on Louisville, Brad, before we move on to Miami. Are you surprised that the market hasn't really moved a whole heck of a lot? Kind of 8.5 was their win total about 2 months ago, more or less painted there, and not a whole lot in the way of movement in terms of their odds to win the ACC either.
I don't know how long that'll last if you get a hint.
I was, as we were talking about this, we may have to coordinate something before the week's out there.
Yeah.
Moving on to the Miami Hurricanes before you guys give away everything that we have in terms of the ACC. The Miami Hurricanes win total sits at 9.5, heavily shaded to the under. We've seen their odds to win the league come down a shade, now kind of in that 4.5, 5-1 range thereabouts. And Payne, we'll get your thoughts on Miami and the state of the program shortly. But Brad, before we get into that, kind of want to talk about the offensive and defensive strengths and weaknesses. This is a Miami team that hasn't won the ACC since joining the conference in 2004. From a program trajectory standpoint, 2022 was about Mario Cristobal establishing his culture. 2023 was about putting the right systems and coordinators in place. Apparently, the victory formation wasn't part of that. And the 2024 season about trying to get a roster ripe with talent to go out there, win the league, and maybe compete in the college football playoff as well. Schedule-wise, they don't leave the state of Florida until October. There's no Clemson, NC State, or North Carolina on their schedule. But even before we get into what they did in the transfer portal, how they beefed up the offense with the addition of Cam Ward, what they've done defensively, the coaching staff here has always been the $100 million question. Mario Cristobal, can he get the best out of one of the most talented rosters in the entire ACC?
Yeah, I have significant doubts. And I know he had a couple good years at Oregon, but again, those were extremely talented teams there, and I'm not sure that they completely hit their potential as far as what those rosters could have been. I mean, let's just look basic stats from last year. It says Miami should have been a top 25 team. If you look at yards per play margin, scoring margin, yards per game margin, definitely should have been a team that won probably at least 2 more games than what they did a year ago. And obviously, we know the one that they absolutely should have won, the Georgia Tech game, that basically came down to terrible coaching that they lost that game. I thought they should have been a top 25 team last year. And with their portal additions, the best recruiting class that they've had since 2008, I've upgraded their power rating about 6 points from the end of last season. So this is a legitimate, as far as a power rating, I think you're doing yourself a disservice if you don't at least have Miami in the top 25, and you probably should have them in the top 20, borderline top 15 type of team, looking at their personnel. I know Payne will get into it. I do think it's funny that, Payne gives me the rundown. You focus on the defense on this team. You focus on the offense of this team. For Miami, he just said, hey, just do a couple of quick hits. So I don't know if we're getting a hour-long State of the Union address from Payne as far as Miami.
No, you dive into as much as you want. And
Brad,
I think we should have. I think we should have just hit record on our pre-podcast discussion of Miami, and it probably would have been sufficient. But no, dive into offense and defense, because I'm just going to spew some overarching thoughts, and it's different because I think we kind of have a differing viewpoint potentially of Miami. Everyone thinks I'm the negative guy. I just kind of deliver it real.
Brad, I mean, this is like Payne recusing himself because he's too close to the fire. So he wants the analytical approach coming from you to try and break down both sides of the ball.
Oh, okay.
I just want to hear the thoughts. I just an impartial perspective.
Yeah.
I'm just here to be a fly on the wall.
Yeah,
I want to hear what you guys are going to discuss.
Yeah, I just, when I saw quick hits, I'm like, I could do a whole podcast series on Miami and what to expect and what not to expect. Obviously, you got to like some of the personnel. We'll start with Cam Ward at quarterback. Definitely an upgrade over an injured Tyler Van Dyke with what they had down the stretch of the season, Williams and Ja'Cory Brown in the bowl game. I don't know if Cam Ward, though, there's a lot of preseason optimism about him, depending on who you believe, and I happen to believe because it's from a variety of sources. I mean, Cam Ward's, probably the highest paid player in the history of college football. Does that mean that he's one of the best players? Forget in the history. Is he a legitimate top 3-4 quarterback in college football this year? I'm not even going that far because I just didn't see it last year. Yeah, production's been good, but to me, a top 3-4 player at that position, when bowl eligibility is on the line for your team, Washington State, is not leading an offense to 7 points against Stanford's defense in the month of November last year. Not happening. So I have my doubts there. I do like the running back room specifically since they got Damian Martinez. I like Mark Fletcher. I know he got a limited number of snaps because of an injury last year. He's a 220-pounder that, if he had to be the lead guy this year, I know they had some depth concerns there. I wouldn't have thought, so ill will of Miami in that regard. Xavier Restrepo, I mean, if he goes the right system in the NFL, we're talking about it can be one of the better slot receivers in the NFL. That's how much I think of Xavier Restrepo. He's off statistically one of the best receiving seasons in the history of Miami football. They lose a couple guys in the receiving room, but man, Isaiah Horton at 6'4", like the body type there. Ray Joseph's a speed guy that was highly regarded out of high school, put on a little bit weight. So Jacoby George is a guy that they're expected to a little bit more of this year. I mean, between him and Restrepo, you're talking 2,000 receiving yards alone between those two. Love their tight ends. They're deep in that room. Offensive line, they do have 3 starters back. Matt Lee, their center, was kind of the guy that, led that room, was the glue of that offensive line last year. We'll see if that's a negative, losing a guy like that. But Maui Noa is a future All-American on the offensive line. You saw him in flashes as a true freshman last year. Let's talk defense real quick. Ruben Bain, I can make a case, might have been the best freshman defensive lineman in the country a year ago with 7.5 sacks. He can be forget freshman All-American. He can be an first team, second team All-American type player this year. Maui Noa's brother on the offense, on the defensive side at linebacker, he decided to come back. Francisco Maui Noa, super productive, leading tackler. He's back. The one position that I'm significantly worried about, and guys that were kind of erasers for him on that back end of the defense last year, Kitchens and Williams at safety. Two really good ball players, both got drafted. I don't know if they fully addressed that in the portal. So that would be an issue there for Miami. I'm not, looking at the schedule. Are they facing, the quarterbacks can fully take advantage of that? We'll see. It's not, I don't see a lot of elite quarterback play that they're facing. But, if Graham Mertz plays like he did at the opener Wisconsin-Illinois game back in 2020, that could be an issue for Miami secondary if we get that Graham Mertz in the opener. It's tough on Miami. I mean, obviously, I've said I got him in my top 20 as far as a power rating. I just, do you expect them to go out there and I know they're going to be favored in the majority of their games. Can you trust them to take care of business against a bunch of these teams? Because I got 6 of their games priced at a touchdown or less. Can you count on Cristobal to win a majority of them? For them to, exceed expectations, that would be getting the 10 wins, something that this Miami program's only done once in the last 20 years. I have my doubts, so it wasn't one of my favorite bets. It's not a significant edge, but I'm more on the pessimistic side. I did take a under 9.5 position.
It's such a polarizing team for a variety of reasons, Brad, and you helped outline. We can check all the boxes when it comes to the overall talent level down there in South Florida and what this group is going to bring to the table. Now, can the coaches get the best out of them if things start a little slowly? Will locker room chemistry completely fracture the team and have everything get off the rails? Remains to be seen. But, Payne, that's why your perspective on the current state of the program for Miami is so important, and curious to get your thoughts on how you're approaching the Hurricanes this year and what you've heard down there frequently a lot of the adult establishments along Las Olas.
I think you hit it perfectly, right? Polarizing is the right verbiage to talk about Miami under this year based upon where pro bettors and what pro bettors are really doing with this team. I think, getting more in depth on some of the, and I have no problem, saying whatever, but I think Brad's, if we kind of injected him with the truth serum, what he would want to say is all these negative things about Mario Cristobal. It's like when he was hired at Miami, it was always going to be about obtaining talent by any means necessary. That is Mario Cristobal's only hope. That is his best trait, is talent. And I'm sure Hurricane fans will hate to hear this, but the Mario Cristobal way is lie, harass, and overpay, right? And that is, when you're dealing with kids, they're easily influenced. It's why 90% of advertisements in this country are geared towards young people. So it's not shocking this method works in acquiring talent. And when you have a backer that can afford to buy the likes of Lionel Messi, college football players are just a rounding error, okay? And
Messi's pretty good at what he does.
Yes. And I think we all know what Mario Cristobal is as a coach, right? Even the largest Hurricanes homers emphatically know by now, after the Georgia Tech fiasco. Mario isn't an X's and O's guy. He's not even an average game day coach. There's not a ton of development happening under Mario. The one position that seems to do it is offensive line, because that's his background. He's got a good offensive line coach, and you're recruiting, the top kids. I think back to the Luck Box Oregon days where Mario was fortunate to inherit a quarterback that got drafted 5th overall, and USC and Washington and Texas were all down at the time. Mario signed 55 blue chip recruits during his time in Eugene with Phil Knight's money. 30 of those 55 ended up leaving Oregon. You look at Mario's first class that he signed in 2022, and sure, some will say transition class. 7 of the 10 blue chips have already left, right? Most of those blue chippers, like Cyrus Moss and Nigel Kelly, he was already recruiting at Oregon. Multiple blue chippers have already left Miami's 2023 class. There are guys that committed to Mario in spring this portal cycle that have already left. There are guys that he recruited twice, right, that have transferred and left him twice. You look at like the uber talented kids Mario inherited, like a Leonard Taylor. He was like a perfect 100 rated prospect in 2021. He kept getting worse under Mario. He turned down a $600K NIL check just to get $100K guaranteed as an NFL free agent. There isn't another coach in this country, not one, that's had a 3-year high school recruiting class average of 7th overall, but is somehow still needed to take 43 transfers over the same period. Usually you look at a coaching staff, it's spending most of its fund in high school and supplementing weak spots with the portal, or they're spending more in the portal and going blue chip hunting out of high school. Like, it's not publicized, and there is no salary cap and there is no CBA, but internally these programs, these NIL collectives and coaches have a budget. There's no such thing for Mario Cristobal right now. He's got daddy's credit card. Anything he wants, he gets. I won't say the kid's name, but like Miami just won a bidding war for a defensive tackle on May 3rd. LSU wanted him. Missouri wanted him. Texas was kicking the tires. The kid was like the 69th best defensive lineman in the 2024 portal class. They paid him $900K. That's 3 times more than what the 39th overall pick in the 2024 draft was making last season for Miami's rival. Okay? There is like, we're not playing Moneyball here. We're just throwing money at the wall and hoping it sticks. And if you go back to our 2022 Miami preview in Mario's first season, I said one thing. My money buys you the luxury of not being great at what you do. And that all this money would allow Miami to be successful by year 3 or 4. This is now Mario's 3rd season. Miami is all in. They currently have the highest paid roster in all of college football heading into this season. More than Ohio State? Yes. And I think what I'm saying is the very reason why we've seen such drastically different opinions among respected college football bettors going back to what we were discussing at the top. And it's happened early in the season, right? Like Miami's win total opened 9.5, gets bet down to 9. We've seen a couple places retrace back towards 9.5. The week 1 line, Miami opens 1.5, 2-point favorite against Florida, gets bet up to as high as 4.5, now back down below the key to 2. So it's bettors basically weighing the talent and a little bit of a softer schedule versus Mario's horrific acumen at anything other than spending money on talent. And I'm going to kind of try to articulate something, but it may come off awkward. I think if you're viewing Miami through the prism of most expensive team in college football, they're all in, national title or bust, I think personally that's truly fair. Miami is going to flop relative to that expectation. But for what we're specifically discussing, right, the 2024 college football betting market, Miami's priced as like the 19th best team in the future market. The win total is mostly 9. Game of the year market's very much being priced like a fringe top 20 team. I find it difficult to believe the most expensive team in the country can't yield results that match or are better than the 19th best team in the country. And that's maybe my differing viewpoint from other people and why we have this differing thought process on Miami. I'm on board with what Brad had to say offensively and defensively. Like, you lured Cam Ward away with a monster offer after he made a video declaring for the NFL draft. I can tell you firsthand, after 6 quarterbacks got taken in the first 12 picks, Cam Ward and his family were not overly happy, okay? But Cam Ward, when you pay him $3.5 million, which is what he's making this year, he has the ability to then help Miami lure other kids in. So you get Damian Martinez. I think I shot Brad a note like a week before he actually entered the transfer portal and signed, went through his visit process, that was as good as done to Miami. And then you bring in Sam Brown. Like, those guys don't come if Cam Ward's not there. So inherently, like, the money for Cam Ward makes a little bit more sense when you can lure other guys. The O-line has potential to be better as the year goes on when you have 2 5-star sophomores that are only growing. You lose Matt Lee, which is a big loss, but you bring in the Indiana transfer who only, I think, will have 9 pressures all last season. Cam Ward and Xavier Restrepo feel like a match made in heaven because Restrepo is this route-running technician underneath, and Cam Ward lives in that area as a thrower. You're going to need a downfield threat here because, Miami's going to want to run the football. And so if you got Cam Ward, who's like in the bottom 20th percentile in terms of throwing distance, then you kind of have this phone booth offense, which could hinder some things. Defensively, their question mark is in the back half. You had a freshman Brown come on last year and start towards the latter part of the season. If he can have a big year, that's great. But they've kind of thrown some things at the safety position. You know, they bring in another from Marshall who's got some familiarity with this defensive scheme. There are some parts here that are interesting, right? And the defensive line is certainly going to be stout. Linebacker, you know, should be solid. Not a ton of depth there, but I think you anticipate Mario potentially, you know, screwing the pooch in a couple games. I can't fathom a team that cost this much, right? That allocates so much funds to high school recruiting, that still needed 43 transfers over the last 3 years. Can't get to a level in the ACC where they're one of the upper echelon teams when you think about the ACC, and, you know, maybe 6 teams care about football and can actually afford to air quotes play football in this conference. So that I think is maybe the differentiator in my thought process. My guess is, right, it wouldn't shock us if they just fall flat right on 9. And we're all having these conversations for not. And, you know, Brad's a happy camper because I believe you went under 9.5 early on in the offseason.
So I'll ask you guys one question, and you can both take it before we close the book on Miami. Given everything that you've said, Payne, from the state of the program and all the resources that Miami's putting into it, Brad from the X's and O's both on the offensive and defensive side of the ball, how important is the Week 1 game against Florida when you look at the snapshot for Miami as a program, a game that we'll no doubt get into in greater detail as we get closer to the season? Biggest
game of Mario Cristobal's career. Because when you acquire talent and you simply do not care what you pay, and again, this isn't like a Florida State Miami thing. I just try to give examples of what I know. We'll get to the kid here pretty soon when we talk SMU. Like Harrison Hunt, for instance, was a Miami kid. Florida State was looking for depth at the defensive tackle position. Weren't going to go after a starter, but they were kicking the tires on Simeon Barrow, and they heard what his price was. They're not going to bring him into their culture at $900K when your starters are not making that much. These kids talk. And Miami has no problem paying Simeon Barrow more than what they're paying other starters that have been loyal to the program longer. And so what happens is you go and lose that first game potentially, or you go and lose a game you're not supposed to because you can't kneel the ball down. And suddenly the locker room turns into a mess. And I think we all talked about this a little bit outside the podcast. It's like, if you are betting Miami this year, you kind of want bets that capture their ceiling, right? So it's more future stuff as opposed to potentially the win total, right? If you're going to go over 9 wins and cash that bet, then potentially things have gone really well in terms of culture in the locker room, and you kind of want to be able to extract the value from some of those higher paying offerings.
Makes a ton of sense. Look, I mean, it's one of the teams that we'll talk about plenty if they're relevant, and we'll brush them to the bottom of the scrap heap if they struggle out of the gate. So Miami will have plenty of opportunities to go out there and earn it, especially early on, to get things going in the right direction as early as Week 1 with their trip to Gainesville. From Miami, gentlemen, to another program that has lofty expectations but didn't spend nearly a fraction of the amount of money the Canes did to build their program into a potential ACC contender. The North Carolina State Wolfpack, their win total sits at 8.5, shaded to the over in that $1.30 to $1.40 range. They're right around 6-1 to win the conference, and this is a team that schedule appears to be very manageable if they can dodge a couple of the landmines early. Will they get tested by games against the Tennessee Volunteers in the non-conference and Clemson over the course of a 3-week span? They don't actually leave the Carolinas for their first 7 games of the season. Seeking their first league title since 1979, Dave Dorn has become the all-time winningest coach in program history, winning 8 or more games now in 4 consecutive seasons. Wolfpack won 9 games last year, but fell short of their first 10-win season since 2002 after a loss to Kansas State in the Pop-Tarts Bowl. They've upgraded their overall recruiting profile, and it's paid dividends. And Payne, the most impactful player that they've added to the offense, didn't come from the high school ranks, but fits Robert and I's system from a mobility standpoint and everything else. And he's a player that anyone who follows Group of 5 college football is going to know all too well. That, of course, being Grayson McCall to pick up and do some of the things that Brennan Armstrong couldn't do leading this offense last season.
Yeah, I think this was going to be a duo that we all thought highly of. I mean, Robert and I, as an offensive mind, we all respect. He's going to have far better quarterback play and weapons to work with this season. Grayson McCall is really interesting to evaluate because he played at such elite levels from 2020 to 2022. He lived near the 80% adjusted accuracy range, rarely ever made a mistake with a turnover-worthy play rate below 3%. But, then some things changed, right? McCall started dealing with injuries. He had an upper body issue. He had a knee injury. And like multiple surgeries later, he's then dealing with staff changes at Coastal, which, come with scheme changes and verbiage change. And so you kind of wonder what the ceiling for McCall is stepping up in class to the P4 level after some of these injuries compared to playing at the G5 level with the most talented team and the best coaching in the Sun Belt. And McCall's never been viewed as a high-end NFL prospect because of the arm talent, and the tight window throws give him some trouble. And there was some conversations about acumen, right? Because Florida was kicking the tires there on him, and the word was he couldn't get into school there. And so there's some other things, right? The lower body mechanics leave a lot to be desired. And then last year didn't help because the knock on McCall was, Coastal Carolina didn't run a pro-style offense, and that, he's going to play more traditional offensive schemes in the NFL. And last season, he got that chance to play in a more traditional offense, and it was his worst year yet. I still believe, despite saying that, like McCall is a massive upgrade for NC State. And the camp reports have been fantastic. He's a leader. He's been super accurate. He's a guy that makes quick decisions. He's a professional college quarterback. That's what he is. NC State wants to push the ball more vertically downfield this season. And to your point at the top there, Todd, I think that meshes well, even though he doesn't have the strongest arm. It's more questions of like fitting the ball into tight windows than it is pushing the ball downfield. And if you look at all qualifying P5 quarterbacks, Grayson McCall does have the very best completion percentage over expectation on throws at or beyond the sticks. Now, I didn't take as much away from NC State's spring game as others because the first-team offense was basically in building confidence mode going against second- and third-team defenses and so many scout players, and NC State rested their best defensive players. I do like what's around McCall relative to what Brennan Armstrong had last year. I mean, it is night and day. You look at the four guys up front, and McKay, Carter, Peak, and Belton, they're all back. Zeke Corral transfers in from Notre Dame. He's a projected starter at center. Probably not like the elite Notre Dame guy, but solid guy that Brad can probably touch on a little bit. But those five along the offensive line have nearly 7,000 college football snaps under their belts. This will be an NC State offensive line that I like a lot, and honestly, it played better in 2023 than the team rushing metrics indicate. If you look at NC State's offensive line, they had one of the largest dichotomies between line yards created and EPA per rush as a team. And what that indicates is the offensive line was moving people and creating space, but the running backs were dreadful. And all they had last year was a slot receiver taking carries, an undersized freshman that was more of an outside zone runner being asked to run between the tackles, especially after Houston basically quit on the season after 3 weeks. That's not the case this season. Jordan Waters transfers in from Duke. 4-star kid, was the 6th best running back transfer in a loaded running back portal class. Waters breaks tackles. He can hit the home run. He averaged 3.4 yards after first contact last season. And then a kid that I'm familiar with in Hollywood Smothers. He returns home to North Carolina and transfers to the Wolfpack. He was a 4-star kid in the 2023 class who chose Oklahoma and more so specifically running backs coach DeMarco Murray over Florida State. Kendrick Raphael rounds out the room. Dave Doran thinks this could be his best running back group that he's had at NC State. Receiver room was a massive question last season, but Kevin Concepcion was a pleasant surprise, right? Especially in the slot. Over 2.3 yards per route run, had 10 touchdowns. He was the wide receiver that doubled as a running back on certain snaps. NC State's collective, let's just put it out there, did a very good job retaining him. Dakari Collins played his best ball late in 2023. That appears to have carried over into spring. Noah Rogers, a top 40 kid in the 23 class, transfers in from Ohio State. You have Justin Jolie, the 3rd-ranked tight end, transfers in from UConn. Wesley Grimes transfers in from Wake Forest, made a big leap last season. Now he's back home. So this is just a far better team in terms of weaponry. I look at this team, and there are some tough spots on the schedule for NC State's offense, right? You face Tennessee the second week of the season. You go to Death Valley to play Clemson. Aside from La Tech and Western Carolina, we don't project a single defense on the schedule outside of the top 100. But I think we see a North Carolina State offense that is leaps and bounds better than last year. Right now we're projecting about 40 spots of improvement year over year in schedule adjusted efficiency. I like what NC State's offense has to offer this season.
There's a reason to be excited about this particular group. You've long talked about, Payne, how difficult a place this can be to play for programs that aren't all that familiar with it, or even fans for that matter, going into Carter Finley, especially in a nighttime environment. Brad, if the NC State offense is going to make strides, it'll make life a little bit easier on Tony Gibson's defense. A trademark 3-3-5 will have a lot of new faces to lean on to play bigger roles if they're to flirt with that ACC title game appearance. Of course, the biggest hole they'll have to fill is for a defensive stat stuffer and leader in Peyton Wilson, who takes his talents to the NFL. But if you read a lot of what NC State has said coming out of the spring, there is a ton of optimism that players like Aiden White and Davin Vann, who stuck around, can be those leaders of a group going forward. You look at Elijah Groves, who steps in, could potentially be a difference maker as much as Sean Brown. When you look at NC State on the defensive side of the ball, if the offense takes a step forward, you don't want to say that the defense can rest on its laurels to a certain extent, but do you expect marked defensive improvement even after they've lost the face of their franchise, so to speak, to the NFL draft?
I do not. So I feel like I'm actually raining on some big ticker-take parade here, considering how Payne broke down the NC State offense, and I agree. I would say the NC State skill position, talent, personnel, what was night and day compared to what I saw last year. Defensively, I do have concerns. You mentioned it. Peyton Wilson, I mean, if we're putting a point spread, value on the most important defensive players in the country, he might have been number one last year for in the entire country. And we saw that data point in the bowl game. This is an NC State defense that gave up about 100 rushing yards per game in ACC play last year. So, I'm taking out the VMI games and stuff like that at the start of the season. 100 yards per game in ACC play. Kansas State ran for 257 yards on them. And he was pretty much the only guy that was missing from that defense in the bowl game. We're talking about a guy in Peyton Wilson that had 138 tackles, 17 and a half tackles for loss, 6 sacks, 3 interceptions. I mean, I watch games like the Notre Dame game where, it wasn't a game-changing play, but he's running down a wide receiver 40, 50 yards down the field, saving, a potential touchdown right before the half. Notre Dame ended up scoring, but it was just he made plays like that consistently, and I just don't think they have the type of player of that anywhere near that caliber to replace him. With that being said, I do like Tony Gibson. He's their defensive coordinator. Year 6 for him. I think he's one of the more underrated defensive coordinators in the country. There are some pieces to work with here. You mentioned Van up front, big dude up front, especially a guy wearing the jersey number 1. He got about a 4th round grade as far as the NFL draft. He's never going to be a 1st round guy because a little bit of lack of size that you would want from that defensive line position, but is a guy capable of being a 2nd round type of talent. He's super productive, really flashes on film. You mentioned a couple other guys. Sean Brown, very active. He's going to move into the linebacker position as they try to fortify, trying to replace Peyton Wilson. Their top cornerback, you also mentioned Aiden White, 10 PBUs last year. He returns. They signed the trend line's kind of up for this program. Obviously, you got coaching continuity to say the least. Your best recruiting class since 2018. You like what you did, particularly on the offensive side of the ball in the portal. I got to take the defense a step back compared to what they were last year. And they had trouble giving up the big play as it was last year. They ranked number 53 in the country. And you lose your guy that was kind of an eraser there in the middle of the defense. I do have some concerns. Now, the one positive is you're not going to have to rely on that defense to win you games 20-17-ish like you did a year ago.
Brad, when you look at NC State, and we've covered both sides of the ball, talked about the coaching and how Dave Dorn is underrated. Do you see them, even with a defense that you have some concerns about and the optimism Payne sees offensively, as a legitimate conference title contender?
I have taken positive positions on NC State with regards to the win total and also future as far as ACC. So even though I think the defense takes a step back, the offense of improvements were so – look, again, I watched 50-plus spring games. I can make a case that NC State's offense was maybe the most glaring unit as far as, oh, wow, I did not expect this from not only quarterback, running back, wide receiver. And I get it. Payne justifiably said, they're going up against the second team defense, so to speak. But this was an offense that was, really, obviously Armstrong was their leading rusher. They had no weapons outside of Concepcion at wide receiver. They literally had one guy, running back and wide receiver positions combined, and now they have 3-4 guys that I think are capable. So, I'm pretty optimistic about this NC State team. If there was a team, and I think there's probably a couple teams, we'll get to one here in a little bit, but there's a couple teams that I think can make that jump. If a Miami doesn't meet expectations, if Florida State isn't as deep as obviously last year's team, if Dabo not relying on the transfer portal, if that comes back to bite them, NC State's one of those couple teams in the ACC that can make a jump.
I also think here's the interesting part, and I'm not going to go too far into this, but I think because we respect Tony Gibson so much, he's one of those defensive-minded coaches now that you give the benefit of the doubt when all of a sudden you're looking through the roster and you're like, geez, this guy left, that guy left. There seems to be a baseline for success defensively. Like, is this going to be as good of a defense as last year? No. But I wonder if the dip is as precipitous as we think just because Tony Gibson's so good with what he does.
And we'll get a good indication of where that defense is right out of the gates. I mean, when you worry about conditioning early on in the season, that game against Tennessee is going to go a long, long way in terms of telling us exactly what NC State has on the defensive side of the ball, because Tony Gibson's going to have all summer to scheme against a young quarterback who showed flashes on tape in Nico Iamavella in the game against Iowa. That's a game that I think every college football fan is going to want to watch, and you'll make adjustments to your power numbers on both of those two teams after just one data point. From NC State, gentlemen, into North Carolina. And when we look at the Tar Heels, their win total, 7.5, shaded to the under. It's a number where we've seen movement from where it was early on. They're a long shot to win the ACC, widely priced north of 40-1, upwards of 50. And as far as the Tar Heels are concerned, after their season opener at Minnesota, North Carolina doesn't leave the state of North Carolina until late October or travel more than 10 miles for a game until October 26th. Their lone road date will come at Duke. As far as Mac Brown, I mean, we hear it every single year. Will Mac retire? Will Mac not retire? How that'll play itself out. He did fire one of his good friends and longtime, well, I shouldn't say long time, but defensive coordinator Gene Chizik, electing to go with Jeff Collins, the former head coach at Temple and Georgia Tech. Despite rampant rumors this offseason, North Carolina was able to hold on to a couple of its best players, as Mario Hampton and Kamon Rucker elected to come back. Special teams, something that plagued this program throughout the spring. We'll see if they get that rectified. But Brad, when we look at North Carolina offensively, I think the most simple, straightforward, and overarching question is, with a drop-off at quarterback from Drake May going to the New England Patriots and the ongoing quarterback battle between Connor Harrell, Max Johnson, and Jacoby Criswell, who transferred in after the spring, what can we expect from this Tar Heels team offensively when they can lean on a bell cow back and a Marion Hampton, a receiving core that, in my opinion, is going to be a little bit underrated, a good tight end room, but an offensive line that may have to fill in a couple cogs and hope that they don't see a major drop-off under center with whoever wins that starting quarterback battle? Yeah,
I mean, you have to downgrade North Carolina's offense, but because you lose a top 5 pick in the NFL draft, and I don't know if he necessarily played like a top 5 pick last year. Certainly did the year prior in his sophomore season. Drake May, in my opinion, left a little bit to be desired last year. I know Caleb Williams took some flack for trying to play hero ball last year for USC. Drake May, I saw a little bit of that in a few of the games. I mean, he was forcing the issue, a big reason why he threw 9 picks last year. But a significant loss, to say the least there. Man, I got to say, generally speaking, if you can't get over the hump at quarter, when you got quarterback play the last 5 years of Sam Howell and Drake May, I don't know if you're getting over the hump with Connor Harrell, who showed some good mobility in the bowl game, and Max Johnson, who's got a lot of experience at this point. But there's a reason why this is his third different school. He gets beat out at his other schools at LSU and Texas A&M. Significant downgraded quarterback, to say the least, no matter who ends up winning that job. On the positive side, though, you mentioned it. Amarian Hampton, one of the better running backs, forget the ACC, the entire country. He had 1,500 yards last year. He comes back. Darwin Barlow is a guy that gives them possibly some good depth there. He's a USC transfer. You lose Des Walker at wide receiver. He was their top guy when he finally got cleared for eligibility. But everybody else from that wide receiver and tight end room is back. J.J. Jones, Bryson Nesbitt at tight end. There's a lot to work with there. They really like this freshman wide receiver, Jordan Shipp. He was one of their more highly recruited players. He'll be a guy that they don't have to overly rely on as far as the experience that they got coming back at wide receiver. But my goodness, Jordan Shipp is a guy that can maybe take the top off of a defense there. You mentioned the offensive line, only one starter back. Man, I got to give more flowers to Payne. Last year, I mean, North Carolina was a very experienced offensive line, but he mentioned I don't know if these guys are any good, even though they bring back a ton of experience, and they weren't that good. So you lose 4 starters, but the guy who graded out as their top guy, Willie Lampkin's the guy back. So I'm not sure that they take that big of a step back on the offensive line, but I'm just reading some tea leaves here. I'll go more program wide. You had 3 straight top 15 recruiting classes there at the start of Mack Brown's second tenure here. Last 2 years, there has to be some questions. How long does Mack got? How long does he got? Not only from a coaching perspective as far as filling out his staff, but, filling out the recruiting classes. They ranked number 29 and 26 after 3 straight top 15 classes. So I don't think the talent level overall in the whole team is as good as what it was the last few seasons. So downgrade offense, even with a ton of guys back at running back and wide receiver and an offensive line that might be a little undervalued. Drake May was that important to this offense. And not only Drake May, but again, your last 5-year quarterback play has been really, really good. I don't expect to get that from Connor Harrell and Max Johnson.
Payne, Jeff Collins takes over a defense that was shredded last season, gave up 27.3 points per game, ranked 11th in the ACC against the run. They are going to probably deploy a little bit different personnel here when we look at Cam Rucker, what he was able to do in terms of making an overall impact, earned second team All-ACC honors last season, but flew under the radar a bit from a national perspective. At linebacker, Power Echols by default kind of becomes the leader of that particular position group. They're excited about Amari Campbell stepping into a bigger role as well. And if you're looking at position groupings, everything you read says the secondary is going to be the deepest group on this particular roster. But if you can't stop the run, it sure as shit ain't going to matter. When we look at North Carolina defensively, Collins taking over for Chiswick. Upgrade, buy, sell, or more of the same in Chapel Hill with their stop unit.
I actually think Brad said something that's really astute and why you should be following high school recruiting to some level if you're doing this at a professional level, because you do get some tea leaves based upon what recruiting classes look like. And just from what I know, what's going on at certain schools, there are players that Carolina currently has in their 2025 class and are leading for in the 2025 class. And there are some teams that are starting to look at those players to start recruiting them now. And you think, hey, that's late in the offing. But it's because there's the potential for Mack Brown to be gone. And so recruiting these players now, even if it's late in the cycle, that you'll have a chance to grab them after Mack is potentially fired. So I thought that was pretty astute from Brad. Defensively, this is going to be a little bit better of a unit, I think. Jeff Collins, you mentioned him, the former Georgia Tech head coach, is now North Carolina's new DC after a year away from football. He obviously struggled as a head coach at Tech, but I do wonder, right? He was the guy that was transitioning from such a different offensive philosophy, and so it was always going to be difficult for him. But defensively, right, he had 2 top 10 defenses at Florida in 2015 and 16, solid Temple defenses. His Georgia Tech defenses were better than what the Yellow Jackets put on the field last year. So there is some hope here. You're kind of combing around for information. Collins has said some things to a couple guys where, he's simplifying everything this year. He's going to be more aggressive. He wants to cater his defense to not what best suits his style, but to his players' best attributes. And so I like that, right? And the biggest thing that Collins said, he wants to play more guys. There were games last season where less than 20 defensive players stepped onto the field. Only 12 guys all season accumulated 400 snaps. We've seen the last couple of years where North Carolina kind of pitters down the stretch because, they don't have any depth and they're playing these guys for a ton of snaps early. I think this is a pretty straightforward thing for Jeff Collins in year one. A lot of his success going to depend on, the conversation it feels like we have annually about North Carolina and their defense. Can all the talent and the blue chippers along the D-line play to their starting rate? I look at Kamen Rucker. He's the horse. He's entering year 5, made a huge leap last season, 60 pressures, 8.5 sacks, 14% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. You need more from Desmond Evans in year 5. He's gotten to an above-average rating, but he's a former 5-star guy. You need more than a 10% pressure rate and 1 sack from Evans. A lot of hype this offseason surrounding Travis Shaw. He was the 12th best player in the 2022 class. He's played below an average P5 defensive tackle for 2 seasons. Javari Ritzy, top 75 kid, was virtually unplayable last season. Needs to get back to his 2021-2022 form. Kevin Hester Jr. is a key cog. I still worry about some of the depth along the D-line. It's the reason, again, that UNC has had back-to-back years of late-season collapses, just not enough depth anywhere. You can't play a Kamen Rucker 900 snaps at a Power 5 level. That's just too many for a defensive lineman. They did add another 325-pound SEC body in Joshua Harris from Ole Miss post-spring. Linebacker room, I think, is the question mark. You lose your leader in Cedric Gray. Some serious depth concerns. Power Eccles actually graded out better than Gray, and he's back. I love Power Eccles, right? He's solid against the run. He's a sure tackler. He's a plus player in coverage, too. The next guy up is Amari Campbell. Campbell played well early last season, then he wore down late as a freshman. That's basically what North Carolina is rolling with at linebacker. Their depth guys are 2 3-star sophomores in Michael Short and Caleb Laval. If Power Eccles misses time, this unit becomes a massive issue. You mentioned the secondary. I think it's the best unit on the team. You have Elijah Huzzy and Marcus Allen. That is probably one of the best corner tandems in the ACC. Hopefully, their stickiness buys the defensive line more time to eat up front. Huzzy just a pure coverage guy. He only gave up 3 touchdown passes the last 2 seasons while adding 31 havoc plays through the air. 52% completion rate allowed when targeted the last 2 seasons as well for Huzzy. I'm interested to see how the rest of the secondary shakes out past the corner play there. You have Intavius Lane. He returns at safety, loves to come down and hit you out of the box. One of the best run defending safeties at the P4 level. Still can cover a little bit as well. DeAndre Boykins at star missed all of last season to a camp injury, but I think there's some confidence there if the coaches are reading the room right. Jakeem Harris is a veteran free safety transferring in from NC State, played over 800 snaps for the Wolfpack in 2021 and 2022, did so at an above average rate. So I think this has the potential to be the best unit on North Carolina's defense. And here's the positive, because I'm trying to be glass half full guy, knowing Carolina was one of the larger professional positions taken on the win total this offseason at under 8.5. It's why we're kind of down in that 7.5 range, although I'm hearing some potential positive views here in the last couple of moments. North Carolina's defense, I think, has a chance to improve year over year because we only have them projected to face 1 top 30 offense this season. There are 8 offenses on UNC's schedule outside the top 70 and our projections, barring health again, right? Because depth is a concern in the front 7 and at linebacker, right? I could see North Carolina's defense making that leap from the 80 range to, the high 50s, mid 60s, somewhere in there. So I do think we see some defensive improvement year 1 under Jeff Collins.
Last thing, Brad, I'm going to come back to you. When we're having this discussion about North Carolina heading into the 2025 season, is Mac Brown still patrolling the sidelines in Chapel Hill?
If you gave me 50-50...
I'll set it a pick 'em, or you tell me how far off my number is.
I would be betting the no. A decent bet on the no. He is not there in 2025.
It's a fair way to look at it and something to continue to monitor throughout the course of the season for all the things that you mentioned, Payne, talking about recruits seemingly having Carolina at the top of their list that may want to flip those commitments before they set foot on college campus. From North Carolina, gentlemen, we'll head to Dallas, where SMU will start their inaugural campaign in the ACC. And when you look at Rhett Lashley's Mustangs, their win total 7.5 with a heavy tariff being applied to go over the total. When you look at them as a potential dark horse in the SEC, right around SEC, Jesus, tells you how rusty I am. ACC, 18-1, more or less the going rate on SMU. As far as the schedule is concerned, SMU went 0-3 against Power 5 programs last year and is 1-9 in the last 10 games against teams from that particular level. They'll have a little bit of a unique travel snafu. They'll go from Stanford, play at Stanford and at Duke in back-to-back weeks, so they will log their frequent flyer miles there. But this is a program that Rhett Lashlee has built up. There's a lot of Power 4 potential transfers that have come in. The roster appears a little bit more ready to compete, but still at the same time, until you're dealing with that grind week in, week out, the ACC is a hell of a lot different than going through the AAC, even if you're bringing in players from Texas, Georgia, Arkansas, Oregon, and Ohio State. So, Brad, when we look at this team offensively and their co-offensive coordinators in Casey Woods and Rob Likens, the expectation is that Preston Stone will be their starting quarterback should he be at 100% to start the season, dealing with that broken leg and the recovery. Sat out spring practice, as you can understand, but Kevin Jennings more than suitable as a backup quarterback. Running back room was a little bit unsettled last year, could never settle on a bell cow back. And in terms of their receiving room, some players to be excited about there. But the big surprise to me, even when you step up in class, they weren't able to retain a lot of their key cogs along the offensive line. So when you assess SMU making the transition from Group of 5 to Power 4, how seamless do you think it can be in Dallas?
Yeah, initially I would have significant concerns, but man, there's a couple reasons that's given me optimism as far as SMU transitioning and maybe even transitioning well and not missing a beat jumping to the ACC. Number one, returning production. I mean, I can only look at what they got coming back from last year, and this is a team that's up there is nationally. 8 starters back, number 11 in the country in returning production. But not only guys coming back, but you mentioned the transfers. They got a bunch of Power 4 guys already in the starting lineup on both offense and defense, and that were already producing at a pretty high level as transfers to begin with. Preston Stone isn't one of those guys, but was a highly regarded 4-star kid coming out of high school, and provided he is 100% off that broken leg at the end of last season, he's, I don't know if he's a top 3 quarterback in the ACC, but he's good enough to have SMU in a bowl game, to say the least, at quarterback. Kevin Jennings, if Stone's not healthy, Kevin Jennings, a guy that's got a ton of experience the last couple of years. He had over 100 pass attempts a year ago, a guy that's a lot more mobile than Preston Stone. You mentioned the running back room. Yeah, they don't have a bell cow, but what they do have, 3 guys that are all come from Power 4 schools that are all capable in an individual game of getting you enough yards, tough yards on a third down. So I think Knight and Johnson and Wheaton, and if you're just looking at depth, all guys, if they all top 300, 400, 500 yards, it would not surprise me. So I would say a good of a running back group as far as depth, maybe not having a bell cow, but a pretty deep running back room in the ACC. Speaking of depth, you got to love what they got coming back at receiver and tight end. I mean, they had 8 guys between 319 and 528 receiving yards last year. All of them return. Now, do they have a bell cow there, receiver? No. A go-to guy that they can count on? No. But, man, they got a lot of depth there. And I got a lot of guys that played a lot of snaps and produced last year. The guy that I like best is actually their tight end, R.J. Maryland, who I think will get drafted. Not a dominant blocker, but, man, in the receiving game, there's not a lot of better tight ends in the country than R.J. Maryland as far as, him in open field as a tight end. You mentioned the biggest concern that I have is the offensive line, and especially when you're taking a significant step up in competition. Usually what we see at the line of scrimmage, these teams aren't there yet. SMU on paper was supposed to be there. They were supposed to have 4 starters back, but a couple of their key guys transferred to Missouri and Oklahoma, so only 2 starters back for them. They are 2 all-conference caliber players, at least at the American level, so it'll be interesting to see how they fill out that rotation on the offensive line. The second thing that's, outside of the returning production and the overall talent level that's giving me some optimism, boy, they got a pretty good draw for year 1 in the ACC to transition. No Clemson, no Miami, no NC State, no Virginia Tech. You get Florida State at home. I mean, on paper right now, I have SMU as favored in as many as 10 games. Does that mean I think they're going 10-2? No. But, if they don't make it, would be a disaster if they're not at least going to a bowl game this year.
And some of the success for SMU, we always associate them, Brad, with how they play on offense. But defensively last year, they took major strides. And Payne, if you believe what Rhett Lashlee has said, we're ahead of where we were last year on defense, and we should be for a group that finished top 15 nationally, but we'll see a slight overall upgrade in terms of the caliber of offense they'll face. And I think the biggest question that all of us have when you see teams making the jump from a group of 5 into the Power 4, how will they hold up in the trenches? Brad highlighted the offensive line concerns he has there. Now we begin to look at this team defensively, and the D-line group is going to look a lot different, but they were able to keep the services of Elijah Roberts, who's a true force in terms of being a disruptive component of what this team wants to do defensively.
Yeah, I think Scott Simons is an interesting name to know. Was under Mike Norvell at Memphis in 2018 before taking the DC job at Liberty. And I know he got to SMU and kind of had a tough year one, but he's finally got some dudes in. Yep. And SMU was one of the most improved defenses in the country last year. And in terms of like schedule adjusted efficiency, they were kind of in that 35 range. And if you're doing some digging behind the scenes, they basically paid their way into the ACC, and they have a treasure trove of cash. So they're spending to allow them to keep a guy, like you mentioned there, in Elijah Roberts, who's SMU's horse. Leads both on the field and in the locker room. Strong, athletic guy. He's got bend around the corner as well. He's an all-ACC type guy. Last year, 19% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. He sets the edge well. SMU's defensive line is noticeably bigger than a year ago. You think about a guy like Tank Booker comes over from Arkansas. There's some internal reports there that SMU was shocked at a 350-pound guy being that athletic. Jonathan Jefferson transfers in from Georgia. Couldn't get on the field there, but I mean, hey, right, in the limited snaps he had, he was efficient, and there's a lot of guys who are blue chippers that don't get on the field at Georgia just because so many guys are coming in year after year there. Mike Lockhart, another 320-pound guy, transfers in from West Virginia, high 3-star portal guy. And then with Rat Leslie's ties to Miami, it helped land Jafari Harvey and Jared Harrison Hunt in the portal. And so you look at Harvey, he's a veteran that's been a plus player in the ACC the last 4 seasons. Similar story with Harrison Hunt, plus player last 4 seasons. FSU wanted Harrison Hunt as a depth guy in their defensive tackle rotation, but he chose SMU for more snaps. But bottom line, if FSU staff identifies you in the portal and gives you the green light, the hit rate is outstanding. So that's a great sign for SMU. There's solid depth off the edge with Isaiah Smith, 15% pressure rate on pass rush snaps a season ago and 7 sacks. So defensive line-wise, it feels like they've prepared themselves for a step up in class here. SMU's linebackers played at an elite level last year. Both Ahmad Walker and Kobe Wilson are back. Both are stout against the run. They were plus players in coverage. That was a duo that had a 9% missed tackle rate. That's what you kind of die for as a defensive coach from your linebackers, just very good, stout tacklers in the middle. Safety room, to me, is loaded with Nicobia. Fantastic in coverage, allowed a 28 passer rating when targeted. You have Jonathan McGill, who was fantastic last year as well, allowed only 5.7 yards per reception when he was the closest man in coverage. All the rave from spring is Ahmad Moses and how he's taken that next step, getting bigger, stronger, faster. He flew around all spring. I think the biggest question mark defensively for SMU, it's cornerback. You look at that room, it's Cal Sanders, probably the best of the bunch at nickel. Scott Simons has talked about needing Jalen Davis-Robinson to take another step. He was recruited to LSU as a wide receiver. He switched to corner and was a plus player in year 1 for SMU. Jahari Rogers, I think, needs to be a little bit more consistent. His play's too erratic. You brought in transfers and Deuce Harmon from A&M. Meh. Right? I mean, Harmon showed well against like the New Mexicos, the Monroes, the Abilene Christians last year, but any legitimate Power 5 offense gave him trouble. Again, this is kind of the area of worry for SMU's defense, both in quality and depth. Their ability in man coverage will be interesting. Their lack of size is worrisome. So, like, when I think about their top corners, right, and Sanders and Rogers and Harmon, they're all 5'10". The one thing that's interesting, it's a little bit more of like an overarching thought. The big question, and you hear it from a lot of people talking SMU, specifically on their beat, and we even mentioned it, is the step up in class to the ACC. And I get it. SMU's defense performed above expectation last season. They went from a unit that was outside the top 100 in 2022, became a top 40 group last year in defensive efficiency. So many players found an unrealized gear. And if that isn't the case again this season, and the perception is SMU stepping up in class, moving to the ACC, does this become a defense that kind of fails to meet expectation? And I go back and I look at last year, SMU was basically afforded the luxury of facing 7 offenses that finished outside our top 85. Against the 3 best offenses on their schedule, SMU lost 2 of those games, and the third gave up .36 EPA per play and couldn't prevent the explosive. That sounds scary when you're heading to the ACC. The potential pause would be, I don't know if that's a thing in 2024. Like, SMU's schedule might be even softer than it was in 2023 in some areas. Like, we're projecting 1 offense inside the top 30 in Florida State. SMU gets the Noles at home. It makes me very nervous that that's when your dog started barking in the background, Todd. Right, SMU has
I might be involved in that game already.
Yeah, I could see that. What number did you get there?
Circa did not have a good number. I'll put it that way.
Okay. So, you look at SMU, it's like one of, if not the easiest P4 schedules in the entire country. So, like, the idea of, like, stepping up in class, they might not be ready for that this year. Like, it might not be as much of a thing in my mind, and the market seems to have agreed with all of the over money this offseason, despite its quarterback returning from a pretty serious injury.
Man, it's the one thing I will say about SMU, and of course, you can't be always left with one lasting impression, just the way that BC was able to kind of take advantage of them. In the Fenway Bowl, I know they played without Preston Stone after winning the AAC and, exercising the Tulane Demons, but just have that lasting image of how things will look when they step up. No, it's not the exact same personnel, but SMU will no doubt be a team that bears watching to see how they make life in the ACC look in their first time through the league. The Syracuse Orange, gentlemen, their win total, 7.5, shaded to the under at a majority of shops in that $1.30, $1.40 range. Long shots to win the league at right around 48-1, thereabouts. And when we look at Syracuse, they'll play 5 road games in 6 dates before closing the season with UConn and Miami. They'll run 3 road games in 4 weeks, make it a little bit more challenging after a flight to Cal. But this is a program that has renewed level of optimism after a coaching hire that allowed them to upgrade the overall talent level to something that we haven't seen at the Harvard of New York in quite some time. When you begin to look at Fran Brown, this is a coach who's got ties to that area, came up through Camden, New Jersey, trying to get a lot of those Northeastern kids to come home and play up at the Carrier Dome. Never been a head coach, but he was able to get Kyle McCord from Ohio State, Fatil Diggs from Texas A&M, so you can understand why they're excited about what may be to come for the Orange. They wound up with 18 players in the transfer portal, 12 of those players coming from the Power 5, 7 SEC talents. And Payne, we may say what we want about Kyle McCord and how he fit in at Ohio State, maybe not being cut from the same cloth clearly as a CJ Stroud. But when you're talking about pure arm talent, this is no doubt a major step up for what Syracuse has dealt with in the position. You look at some of the other positions on offense, like Kent Allen, more than capable of being a top-tier back. Aronde Gadsden should be able to return from injury and give them a good option there. And an offensive line that may need to gel with a bunch of transfers, but you can understand why Syracuse higher expectations in 2024 than we've seen during the twilight of the Dino Babers era.
Yeah, I think we're in lockstep there with our kind of perception of Syracuse offensively. Now, Kyle McCord isn't a national title contending caliber quarterback, and I think you certainly have to normalize some of his great efficiency metrics last year playing with Marvin Harrison Jr. and all the 5-star receivers at Ohio State. But McCord is certainly far better than what the naysayers will have you believe. And perceptually, like, that poor kid was doomed from the jump having to follow C.J. Stroud and be compared to him. When you look at McCord, he knows where the ball needs to go, right? He throws with anticipation. He looks comfortable. He's a leader. He's accurate. There's only 6 Power 4 quarterbacks returning this season with a better career EPA. And when you keep him clean, he is a different quarterback. 79% adjusted accuracy, graded out QB 19 from a clean pocket among Power 5 QBs last year. The arm strength isn't the greatest, so when he throws with anticipation and reads it wrong, it does lead to some mistakes. McCord isn't the greatest athlete, so he does kind of drop off a cliff under pressure. But this is a massive get for Fran Brown, Syracuse. And I think McCord is easily Syracuse's best quarterback since Eric Dungey. So that's a positive, and I think there's some fun weapons here. You mentioned LaQuinn Allen. That's a damn good back right there. 66% of his rushing yards last season came after first contact, and think about what he had to deal with last year. He's going to have far more room to run this season because Syracuse can actually threaten a defense through the air, right? I mean, he had tight end playing quarterback, running Wildcat. I mean, he looked at 10 guys in the box all season. So I think it's going to be a good year for Allen. He's solid catching the ball as well. You have the high 3-star freshman running back. You've seen Willis, who looked very nice in the spring game, so there's some depth there, especially if he can run with a little bit of a lower pad level. You have Yazeed Haynes, a 4-star wide receiver that signed with Georgia initially. He's going to be a day one contributor. You mentioned Aronde Gadsden, who was cleared from his foot injury on May 3rd. Only played in 2 games last season, so if he returns to the 2022 form, when he was first-team All-ACC, that's a heck of a security blanket for McCord to have there because, Gadsden's 6'5", massive catch radius. He's versatile enough to line up throughout the different positions at wide receiver. And then they added Justice Ross Simmons late in the portal from Colorado State, big body receiver with some production. Traber Pena and McCord seem to have a nice rapport there in the slot. Pena's back after missing all but 1 game last year. So a lot more weapons for Syracuse this year. Offensive line, I think, will be improved. You brought in Savion Washington, who transferred in post-spring, had a very nice 2022 season at Kent State, was Colorado's best O-lineman last year with positive grades, both as a run blocker and pass blocker. You bring in Demetrius Weatherspoon, who transfers in from Harvard. He was an elite lineman at that level, so I envision him being average or better with the transfer to the P4 level. You have Reed back at center, only allowed 9 pressures in 13 games last season, and then you have seniors and Mark Petrie and Jacob Bradford, but it wouldn't shock me if younger guys push for a starting spot throughout the course of the season, like a Joshua Miller, a 2023 Georgia commit that transferred in. So I think the O-line will have far better injury luck as well last year. That was a unit that was decimated early in the spring. So a big jump up there for the offensive line. But what makes Syracuse, I wouldn't say as polarizing as a Miami, but very interesting, and the reason for a win total that's now at like 7.7 isn't necessarily their own power profile, but the schedule. This is very much a reality versus schedule situation. Fran Brown gets a gift in year 1, not having to face Florida State or Clemson. You look at the non-con games against Ohio, Holy Cross, who's transitioning with coach and quarterback, and then you have UNLV and UConn, and unlike other ACC teams that have Power 4 opponents in their non-con, like they just don't, right? And Syracuse's 2 West Coast trips aren't as bad as you would suspect, right? The first one is after a 4-game homestand that includes a bye. The second one isn't until the middle of November at Cal, and that's sandwiched between Boston College and UConn. Georgia Tech, Virginia Tech, and Miami are all at home. So I think Syracuse has the ability to start fast here, and if you're Fran Brown, new coaches, building a new culture, trying to get guys to trust you and buy in, like the best way is winning. And I think Syracuse has a shot to do that early. Specific to the offense, Kyle McCord in that unit probably not going to be overwhelmed too much. We're projecting 1 top 25 defense on their schedule. But what's interesting is now I'm a little hesitant, right? We're starting to get to uncomfortable market pricing territory, and no doubt Fran Brown has given a jolt of energy to this program. He's going to be a much better recruiter than Dino Babers, but we've gotten to a point where Syracuse needs to win 8 games to clear the total, and I'm all for calling for a bowl game, but winning 8 is totally a different story when we're not quite sure what Fran Brown, the game day coach is, the X's and O coach is, right, the preparation coach is. So we're starting to get to a little bit of a nerve-wracking market pricing level for Syracuse.
We can talk all we want about the offense and what they have there. Defensively, Elijah Robinson follows Fran Brown from Texas A&M to take over as DC, and this is a team that's a fringe top 50 group in returning talent. But when you look at some of the difference makers that they have, some familiar names that we saw contribute last year in linebacker Marlo Wax, Justin Barron at defensive back, and Elijah Clark at DB. They went out there, hit the transfer portal, bring in some disruptors along the defensive line. And I think one of the things you look at from a program standpoint when you bring in a new head coach and new coordinators is the players want to stick around and play for the new guy. Syracuse has that working in their favor. But this will be a group, to Payne's point, that has to live up to some expectations. situations, and getting 8 wins is a hell of a lot different than just keeping a program afloat. When you begin to look at Syracuse on the defensive side, are there areas of strength that you're excited about? Are there areas of concern? And what should we make of the first-time, full-time defensive coordinator in Elijah Robinson?
Yeah, I'm pretty flat on the power rating as far as the defense, and maybe some are, a little bit. Wow, you're flat with all the talent that they're bringing in. Yeah, because I question a little bit of the depth on the defense. Yeah, the frontline players I think are pretty good. Obviously, you mentioned top 4 tacklers are back. Marlo Wax is really good at linebacker. Safety Justin Barron, very high on him. He stands out on tape. I see one of the preseason magazines said he was the glue of the defense. He was the guy that stood out the most to them on tape. I like what they did up front. As far as the portal, they had to, because Ukachukwu and Darton up front were 2 of their better players, and both are gone. But to get a guy like Fadil Diggs from Texas A&M, already knows the defensive system, a high-talented guy who, a guy that could you count on him to play 500 snaps at Texas A&M in a rugged SEC West schedule? No, but my goodness, he can be a pretty good productive player at Syracuse, and he was a defensive MVP in the spring. A guy that I didn't know much about that really flashed in the spring game, Deion Wilson, a 300-pounder from New Mexico State, really flashed to me. Isaiah Hastings, another really talented kid from Alabama, wasn't going to crack the lineup as far as Alabama, but can be, again, when you're comparing his talent level to what Syracuse has had on defense the last 5-6 years, certainly an upgrade there. They did some smart things in the transfer portal. Devin Grant, who I thought was Buffalo's best defensive player last year, a safety, they bring him over. He follows along with Robert Wright, who was a defensive coordinator at Buffalo last year. He's also on this year's staff. They bring a familiar name in Deuce Chestnut in the secondary. He was a 2-year starter at Syracuse before leaving and going to LSU. Couldn't crack the lineup against, in the SEC. If it sounds familiar, it sounds like a broken record there. But obviously he's back. Not good enough at LSU, but I think he's good enough to be a productive player at Syracuse. Clarence Lewis, not an elite player at Notre Dame, wasn't going to be a starter, but was going to be a 300-snap type player at Notre Dame. He transfers in. He can be a very productive player for Syracuse. So I like what they did in the portal. What I don't like, and this is a little bit in the weeds here, is let's look at some of the opposing offenses and teams. Now, I do agree with Payne that the schedule is fortunate for Fran Brown, but you look at Georgia Tech in week 2. They're obviously a much more offensive, we talked about it, much more offensive-driven team. Stanford, Troy Taylor, offensive-minded coach. I think they're much improved there. UNLV, obviously, much more offensive-driven team than defensive side of the ball. NC State, we talked about it, much improved offense this year. Pittsburgh, we haven't talked Pitt, but they're moving up tempo, going to be much more offensive-driven this year. So there's a lot of teams on their schedule that are going to be among more of the improved offenses in the country. So while the talent level has been upgraded, I worry, especially that back half there, that final 6-game stretch. I'm not sure that they have the quality depth enough there to make a massive uptick from where they were a year ago under Rocky Long, and you mentioned it. They were right around 50th in the country.
Going to be an interesting team to watch. The Georgia Tech game, of course, I think every college football fan that gets into this on a week-in, week-out basis will use that as a litmus test and a measuring stick to figure out where each of these programs are headed. Syracuse would have a subsequent bye week and a chance to regroup if needed or continue to build on some of that momentum. You mentioned the UNLV game, Brad. Interesting travel spot for them because it'll be back-to-back road games when they come out west to take on the Rebels, and then they'll go to NC State the week after. The week following a home game against Holy Cross. So you wonder how some of those scheduling quirks work for a team that no doubt should be an interesting watch with a first-year head coach trying to turn the program around. Last team that we have a deep dive scheduled for today, gentlemen, the Virginia Tech Hokies. And when we look at Virginia Tech in terms of their win total, it opened at 7.5 over -140, or I should say there may be shorter prices there. This was about 2 months ago. We've now seen that price move out to 8.5 with heavy juice shaded to the under. We've also seen Va Tech take some money as a little bit of a dark horse to win the ACC. And this is a group that's non-conference schedule, gives them all the chances to build some momentum. Headed into a road date against Miami. A game against Rutgers provides a revenge opportunity from last season. That'll probably be a measuring stick for where Va Tech is. When we look at Coach Brent Pry's team, they don't lose much in the way of personnel from last year's squad, and most importantly for them, Payne, they bring back rising star quarterback Kyron Drones, who really gave them a shot in the arm when they went away from Grant Wells to Drones. The rushing game took off. There was a little bit of pop in the passing attack, and they were able to go into the portal and bring in a player that has a lot of that same skill set in Colin Schley as an accomplished veteran backup, which I think will be underrated if Drones were to miss some time. We look at this group from a skill position standpoint. Ollie Jennings returns after dealing with an injury. The offensive line, a bevy of experience. Measuring Va-Tech offensive capabilities, how have you gone about handicapping this side of the ball?
We saw major strides the final 7 games when Drones became more comfortable running the offense. But when Va-Tech stepped up in class, even down the stretch, their efficiency failed to meet expectations. So you look last year, 3 top 40 defenses in Florida State, Louisville, NC State. They just shut the Hokies down, right? It was 10 offensive points against FSU. It's probably 3 without a missed block in the back. Drones was held to a negative EPA per pass in that game. Had 3 points against Louisville, and again, Drones had a negative EPA per pass in that one. You look at the first half against NC State, the Hokies were held to a 21% success rate. Tech had 14 points on 3 explosive plays the first 52 minutes of that game. So that was the only offense, right? And so when they stepped up in class, it was a little nerve-wracking kind of for when you're projecting forward. Now, where the optimism lies is virtually every meaningful piece of the offense is back. And on paper, Va-Tech has the most offensive returning production. Kyron Jones is interesting because he transfers in late December last year. You mentioned Grant Wells starting the season. And your hope is that now that there's this familiarity with what Drones is doing, right, with what's returning along the O-line, what's returning at receiver, because that was a unit that was hit by some injury last year, that your offensive coordinator, Tyler Bowen, should feel more comfortable expanding the offense, becoming less predictable and more creative. When I watched Va-Tech last year, it was basically like a Tecmo Bowl offense where it appeared Bowen only had 4 plays to choose from. And that's not what I would expect from an OC that spent time on Doug Peterson's staff. Some of that redundancy is because of Kyron Drones' limitations, which you would hope have improved this season. Really struggled when his first read wasn't there. Struggled when he wasn't assisted with a play fake element. More than a 5% turnover-worthy throw rate without a play fake element. Drones was extremely fortunate to only have 3 balls picked off because he had 14 turnover-worthy throws. The deep ball accuracy has to improve because the whole idea of having a mobile quarterback that's 235 pounds and averages nearly 7 yards a rush is that defenses are forced to load the box, right? Play with a third linebacker on the field, cheat a safety down. And so when that happens, Drones has to take advantage of those downfield shots. Last year, he didn't. QB 125 out of 142 qualifying quarterbacks and adjusted accuracy on 20-plus yard throws. Fortunately, there are serious weapons at receiver this year. I think this is far and away the deepest position on the entire roster. On a national level, Va-Tech has one of the more underrated pass-catching groups, so I think defenses won't be able to cheat run as much. You mentioned Ollie Jennings, only played 1 game last season. Gallo, their tight end, was injured. It is a very deep group when you look at Felton, Lane, Jennings, Green, and Gallo. The running back room, to me, has both upside and depth. We know what Tootin was, damn good back. They tried to get him involved on special teams just because he was that playmaker for them. Averaged 3.8 yards per rush after first contact. I think there's upside in the room. From what I saw Prelo do in the spring game, my goodness. And then offensive line production last year was abysmal, but I think you're banking on growth with some continuity, some maturity. Virtually everyone returns. If you look last year, Va-Tech was forced to start redshirt freshmen at left tackle, left guard. So there's more experience this season. You have Caden Moore, going to be his second year at center. Bring in a Georgia State transfer in Montavious Cunningham to help on the right side. He was a plus player, really grew towards the latter part of last season. So if you can get that improvement continuing in a forward momentum, right, that'll be a nice get. Parker Clements has been serviceable at right tackle. He's heading into year 4. So you can see why there is real optimism, especially on offense. And I think Va-Tech has a real shot to gain some early confidence, right? You start the season with Vandy, Marshall, ODU. Those are 3 defenses projected outside our top 100 for the entire season. We're projecting Virginia Tech faces just 2 defenses in our top 20. If you look at the schedule in totality, like Va-Tech projects to face defenses with an average efficiency rank of 72nd. It's why, we're looking right now, have them as a preseason favorite in 10 games. But in terms of like being able to win the ACC, it's all on Drones to be a better passer.
Brad, when we look at Virginia Tech on the other side of the ball, last year's stop unit isn't going to remind people of the elite Virginia Tech defenses led by Bud Foster, but it was no doubt a step in the right direction for the depths of the program had dropped to you under Justin Fuente's leadership. They finished last season ranked inside the top 20 for the first time since 2017, and there are a lot of playmakers at all three levels that give people reason to be excited, most notably a tandem of guys in the defensive backfield that'll probably be honing their craft on Sunday when their time in Blacksburg is up. They address some of their needs in the portal to try and beef up the defensive line some, but when you look at the stop unit for Virginia Tech from top to bottom, is there reason to believe that they can use last year as a jumping off point and continue to build to support an offense that has some playmakers and the capabilities of putting up crooked numbers?
I do. I've upgraded Virginia Tech's defense. So again, you mentioned it, not one of those elite Bud Foster units that we saw in the late '90s or early 2000s, but certainly functional. You look top 30 in the country in yards per play, 20th in total defense. We were able to get after the quarterback with 39 sacks last year. And again, I like the pieces that they got coming back. 8 starters back. When you look at returning production, similar to offense, among the tops in the country. I will say I also like their defensive coordinator. Chris Marv is probably a name to know. They interviewed him during the spring game, and a lot of defensive coordinators are like so focused and they don't have the ability to multitask. It's tough giving an interview during a game because they're so focused. Chris Marv's calling plays, interviewing, talking about players, talking about his roster, talking about recruiting. I mean, it was very impressive to see how he handled that during the spring game. So thumbs up for him in that regard. Also thumbs up. I talked about their ability to get after the passer last year. It was led by a kid, Powell Ryland, a Florida transfer, 9.5 sacks. I was watching the Syracuse game. I think I bet Syracuse got an unbelievable number and had no shot. He was one of the reasons why I had no shot. He was consistently after the passer in that game and most of the season. I would say one of the more underrated transfers in the entire country, regardless of position. Aeneas Peebles, a Duke transfer on the defensive line. He was Duke's highest-graded defensive player among players that got at least 200 snaps off a good Duke defense. And to get a guy like that on the defensive line of Virginia Tech, again, a major upgrade there. Speaking of the defensive line, they had a couple of other incoming guys. A JUCO kid by the name of Kanari Copeland, who's really stood out in spring games. Speaking of standing out in the spring game, Keyshawn Burgos at defensive end. I mean, was a game wrecker in the first half of the spring game. A guy that, he made a couple plays. This guy made like 5 or 6 game-changing type plays in the first half. And again, he doesn't need to be, am I talking about a first-team All-ACC type player? No, but when you got a guy like Powell Ryland on the other side of the defense, a guy that's perfectly capable of getting 5, 6, 7 sacks himself this year. Keely Lawson at linebacker is a guy that stands out not only because he led the team in tackles, but he's just got a different type of body type there at linebacker, 6'4", 220, can really run. They have 2 legit Virginia Tech cornerbacks in Dorian Strong and Delane that are super productive, super experienced, that are capable, of shutting down, at least on a relatively soft schedule, a lot of the opposing offenses that they're going to face. And speaking of that, I mean, I agree with Payne. Outside of a road trip to Miami and a home game against Clemson, which I don't think either one of those games are completely fall under the category of unwinnable. There's a Virginia Tech team on paper. It's going to be favored in 10 of their 12 games. They were a little bit better than the record indicated last year because they lost. They had 3 close games and they lost all 3. So I am part of the Virginia Tech money, at least early on in this offseason.
Sure, Hokie faithful will be thrilled to hear the ringing endorsement that both of you gentlemen have provided for a program that was once one of the gold standards in terms of ACC relevance on a national level, and it appears that this coaching staff has them headed in the right direction for big things potentially on the horizon if their young quarterback develops and the defense continues to gel and perform at a level that we saw flashes of last season. You can follow Brad on social media at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. Follow me as well. Most importantly, though, for all things Bet the Board related, be sure to follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And gentlemen, that does it for some of the deep dives that we're going to provide for the ACC. It is a labor of love, no doubt, for those folks who've listened to this podcast in its entirety, but a couple other teams that stood out, Brad, that I wanted to kind of get your high-level take on pretty quickly. Boston College, a team who sees their win total sitting at 4.5, shaded to the over. It's a program that'll draw Florida State in their opener, with Florida State already having a coaching game under their belt. We saw them go into the transfer portal to get a head coach, with Bill O'Brien returning to his roots in Chestnut Hill to take over the program. And you look at some of the way he's tried to build up his staff. Will Blackman returns to handle alumni relations, and maybe it can be a return to prominence or some level of for this BC team that did see Thomas Castellanos perform at a high level for stretches. They had running backs that went out there and were able to make a splash. Plenty of questions abound in terms of their offensive line. As far as their defense, all 4 spots on the defensive line appear to be shored up. There is some depth to be excited about at linebacker, but the secondary remains one of the bigger concerns. When you look at Boston College and the Bill Bryan takeover, is there reason to believe that this team can exceed expectations, or it'll be a program that's going to take a couple of years to try and rebuild to ACC relevance?
No, I mean, I think Payne's going to severely disagree with this, but generally speaking, I like the O'Brien hire. So I liked Jeff Hafley, who departs as a defensive coordinator. Obviously, Hafley didn't want anything to do with the NIL and what some of the off-field being a CEO type of coach, what that details. So he's off to Green Bay, but I think O'Brien, fine. You mentioned it. He's familiar with the area. I thought he filled out his coaching staff well. I like the continuity as far as what they return as far as production wise. I think they're really deep at running back and wide receiver. Defensive line was the most improved group in the spring. Castellanos, who you think you'd have most optimism about because he's just a dynamic athlete. I worry. I don't want O'Brien to get in too relying on his pass game too much.
That won't end well.
I'm a little concerned because Castellanos struggled in the spring game. Please, just let him be, let him run around and do his thing. So that would be my biggest concern there. The other biggest concern, we talk a lot of teams here schedule-wise. Well, the NC States and Virginia Techs of the world and Syracuse got relatively beneficial schedules. Boston College did not. So while I think this year's team's a little bit better than last year's team that made a bowl game, I am not running in the window to bet Boston College to get to a bowl game. There's a reason why the win total is 4.5.
Payne, Bill O'Brien, we know his final days as offensive coordinator, or whatever the hell you want to call him, that he accomplished in New England. I'll give BC credit for scrambling to find a replacement for Jeff Hafley. But to Brad's point, no, you have some strong feelings about the way he wrapped things up dealing with the Bailey Zappi, Mac Jones experience.
I don't want to be negative here because I think BC is one of really the toughest jobs. Like, what's considered, positive here for this outfit?
6-6.
Yeah, I mean, so if that's the goal, then I think Bill O'Brien might be fine, and maybe he's better operating a team on his own. I just know, and I kind of mentioned this off air, is when we started to dig into New England this year, right, this offseason, and you start looking at what Bill O'Brien was doing offensively with the Patriots last year, and you're like, oh my God, suddenly the pencil eater, Matt Patricia, who was a defensive-minded coach being disguised as an OC under Bill Belichick, was like, maybe he wasn't as bad as we thought, because Bill O'Brien was that dreadful. But to Brad's point, you do like the running back room here. Some of the weapons out wide are nice, and if you can keep Thomas Castellanos in a type of offense that best suits his attributes, right? There's a reason. Listen, he was like a 5-star kid. All of these SEC programs want him. They just didn't want him at quarterback. And he's been hard-pressed, right? He's got to pound the table. He's like, I got to be a quarterback. And so here he is playing at BC, and he has a ton of deficiencies. And, for a guy that's that mobile, right, you look at some things like completion percentage versus pressure. He's in like the bottom 20th percentile of all quarterbacks. You look at, some of the downfield on target rate numbers. He's in the bottom 20th percentile. So if you're going to use him as that added man in the box, the +1 runner, then this has a chance to look better than I think. Bill O'Brien is a pro-style offensive guy. And so you wonder what that meshing looks like.
That's a fair assessment. There is no doubt that if he's going to try and turn Thomas Castellanos into something he can't be, it's going to be an experiment that doesn't end well, and you're going to have plenty of opportunities to bet against BC early and often in the season. Now, on the West Coast in the ACC, Brad, Stanford, we've seen their win total open 3.5 shaded under, now bet up to 3.5 shaded over. Schedule, that's going to be one of the most interesting aspects when you figure out how many road trips they're going to make from Palo Alto to the Eastern time zones. 2 straight ACC road games right out of the gate against Syracuse and Clemson. But that's about it for true conference games in terms of some of their longest road trips, in terms of what they'll have to be able to accomplish. And when you look at Stanford, they do get 2 big games at home to start things off against TCU. Well, there'll be more than a touchdown underdog on a Friday night. FCS Cal Poly comes in there. But I think you and I are both very optimistic about the coaching staff, specifically as it pertains to Troy Taylor and what he can do as far as year 2. We saw a group last year. We know it was going to be a lot of growing pains, but they went out there and fought from start to finish. Maybe the highlight, the comeback that they showed in Boulder against Colorado. You have a quarterback in Ashton Daniels poised to take the reins. You have a receiving core that's a little bit underrated with a couple of weapons there that I think are pretty solid. And defensively, look, they allowed more than 32 points per game now over 3 straight seasons, so it's not something that's going to remind us of peak David Shaw teams. But this is a Stanford team, coaching-wise, that appears to at least be headed in the right direction and maybe have a chance to exceed odds makers' expectations.
Yeah, Troy Taylor entering year 2, super sharp guy, X's and O's, more offensive driven, comes over from Sacramento State, was really put in a bad spot last year. I mean, Stanford was in the bottom 3 as far as returning production, and keep in mind, Stanford can't go out and fix the roster through the transfer portal. They have to rely on high school recruiting, so despite the fact that he was dealt a pretty bad hand as far as returning production off a terrible team to begin with, they lost to an FCS team, and yet somehow he still managed to win 3 games last year. Now flip forward to this year. Now Stanford goes from bottom 3 in the country as far as returning production to top 3 in the country in returning production. So night and day as far as experience. All 5 starters back on the offensive line. Io Manor at wide receiver, who really took off the knee brace against Colorado, and I think 10 million people watched it or whatever the viewership was. You saw one of the best comebacks in college football in recent memory in that game. I think from a power ratings aspect, this is the most improved team in the ACC. I am part of the over money.
Makes sense. It's, to your point, one of the more difficult places to recruit. Not much in the way of home field advantage by any stretch when you go up to Palo Alto, although maybe they can lull some of these ACC opponents to sleep when you're playing in front of a stadium that's about 25% filled if the team is fighting to try and get to 4 games. But Troy Taylor, an offensive mind that Stanford is fortunate to have, and we'll see if he's able to get this team where they need to go, which in the case of odds makers would be to 4 wins if you're sitting on an over ticket. Gentlemen, this was a long, lengthy endeavor. I think we all anticipated it would run a couple hours. I'm not sure that we thought we'd be flirting with nearly 3, like a lengthy motion picture. We know a lot of our listeners will be out there listening to these teams one at a time, and that's what we encourage them to do with nearly 2 months until we see meaningful football on the horizon. But we do still have one final order of business to transact, and that, of course, is the best bet portion of the program. So, Mr. Payne Insider, the floor is yours.
I'm going to be concise since we are pushing towards 3 hours. It didn't feel like that long, but now that I look up, I said, holy shit. We've already discussed this team. Every single team will be time-stamped above. Let's go Georgia Tech under 5.5 wins, minus $1.60. My thoughts, Todd's thoughts, Brad's thoughts are all in the team capsule that will be time-stamped above. Easy peasy.
All right, boys. 1 Power 4 conference in the can. 3 left to go. College football continues to inch closer, and I know our listeners will be with us every step of the way for the kind of comprehensive, in-depth breakdowns that you're not going to find anywhere else in the content space. 2.5+ hours of ACC goodness here. And you know what, guys? We didn't even get to all the teams. No mention of Pittsburgh, no mention of Duke, Wake Forest, Virginia. So for fans of those programs that stood by and waited with bated breath, alas, there are plenty of annual magazines that you can read instead to find out how poor the prognosis is for your particular program. So for Brad Powers, Payne Insider, I am Todd Fuhrman. Want to wish all of you guys and girls the best of luck with all of your off-season studies. And most importantly, the biggest takeaway from the ACC, other than Payne rooting for Miami to crater and Florida State to return to brilliance and compete for a national championship, we'll have a Georgia Tech regular season win total under the posted total in hand. And come hopefully early November, we'll see you at the window.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.